Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the unexpected camaraderie amid the chaos of the US Civil War. What you're about to discover is that soldiers from opposing sides sometimes traded coffee and stories under the moonlight. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the grand theater of American history, the 19th century had all the elements of a blockbuster drama: deep-seated tensions, stark economic divides, and the proverbial elephant in the room that was slavery. Act 1, if you will, opens on a nation teetering on the edge of chaos, where the industrial North and the agricultural South were about as compatible as oil and water, or, perhaps more fittingly, as agreeable as a cat with a bath. Let's set the scene. The North had embraced the clamor of industry with open arms, churning out goods faster than you could say, assembly line. By the 1850, factories dotted the landscape like freckles on a redhead. In 1860, the North boasted a staggering 110,000 manufacturing establishments, employing over 1 million workers. This burgeoning industrial empire churned out $1, $5 billion worth of goods annually, a number that would make any capitalist swoon. Meanwhile, the South stayed true to its agrarian roots, where cotton was not just king, it was the entire royal court. The region was producing 75% of the world's cotton, a fact that made southern planters feel like they held the globe by the lint-covered fingertips. But this wasn't just a simple case of different economic strategies. Oh no, things were a tad more complicated. The North's industrial boom meant an influx of immigrants seeking work, too. 5 million new arrivals between 1850 and 1860 alone. These fresh faces added fuel to the economic fire, and as a side effect, made the northern states a bit like a crowded subway car at rush hour. More people meant more political clout. The North was gaining power in Congress, and the South was watching its influence slip away faster than a greased pig at a county fair. Enter the Southern economy, which was less about factories and more about fields. Agriculture was the name of the game, and it was played with the help of an enslaved workforce. By 1860, around 4 million enslaved people labored in the South, generating immense wealth for their owners and none for themselves. Slavery wasn't just a cog in the Southern economic machine, it was the engine. Without it, cotton plantations would grind to a halt, and the genteel Southern lifestyle would be as doomed as a snowman in July. Now, let's talk politics, because that's where things get juicy. The concept of states' rights was like catnip to Southern leaders. They argued that states should have the power to make their own decisions, particularly when it came to the legality of slavery. But beneath this states' rights rhetoric lay a simple truth. They wanted to preserve and expand their peculiar institution. The North, where abolitionist sentiments were on the rise, was increasingly seen as a meddlesome neighbor, peeking over the fence and tut-tutting at the South's way of life. The elephant in the room was growing restless. Slavery was the issue that everyone danced around like it was an angry rattlesnake. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had been an early attempt to keep the peace by drawing a literal line on the map. No slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 parallel. Fast forward to the 1850, and that line was looking more like a squiggle. Compromise of 1850 tried to patch things up by admitting California as a free state, while leaving the status of slavery in other territories up to popular sovereignty. In other words, hey, let the people decide. What could possibly go wrong? Abolitionists were raising their voices, and sometimes their fists. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin hit the shelves in 1852 and sold like hotcakes, 300,000 copies in its first year alone. The novel put a human face on the brutality of slavery and made Northerners squirm in their seats. It was a wake-up call, a literary slap in the face that shouted, hey, this is what we're up against. Meanwhile, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 tossed a match into the powder keg. It repealed the Missouri Compromise line and left the decision of slavery up to the folks who settled in those territories. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed in, and soon Bleeding Kansas was a thing. Picture West Side Story, but with more rifles and less singing. Violence erupted, making it abundantly clear that compromise was becoming a quaint notion of the past. The political landscape wasn't just shifting, it was cracking wide open. The Whig Party, once a major player, crumbled like stale bread, unable to reconcile its northern and southern factions. In its place, new political forces emerged. The Republican Party, founded in 1854, was a hodgepodge of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists united by one key issue: stopping the spread of slavery into the territories. When Abraham Lincoln, a former Illinois congressman with a penchant for tall hats and tall tales, emerged as the Republican candidate for president in 1860, the stage was set for a showdown. Lincoln's election was the final straw for many in the South. He wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states, yet he won the presidency. To Southern leaders, it felt like the rest of the country was dictating their way of life. They saw the writing on the wall, or at least they thought they did. The fear was that Lincoln's presidency would spell the end of slavery, and with it, their economic and social order. It was as if they'd been invited to a party only to find out it was their own going-away bash. As 1860 slipped into 1861, the southern states began to secede, one by one, like beads slipping from a broken necklace. South Carolina was first, declaring its departure on December 20, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. They formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president, and set up shop in Montgomery, Alabama. It was like starting a new country with all the optimism and none of the planning. The nation held its breath, teetering on the brink of war. The antebellum era, with its simmering tensions and uneasy compromises, had run its course. The question of whether a house divided against itself could stand was no longer theoretical. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on the bloodiest conflict in American history. 1861 was the year the pot boiled over, and the United States learned a harsh lesson about the cost of ignoring the elephant in the room. So, as 1861 dawned, the United States was less a cohesive nation, and more like a rickety roller coaster clattering up to its first heart-stopping drop. The secession domino effect had left the Union looking a bit like a jigsaw puzzle with vital pieces missing, and tensions were tighter than a drum. Enter the first major showdown, Fort Sumter. This was the flashpoint where words turned into action, and boy, did things escalate quickly. Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold smack dab in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, found itself in a rather awkward spot. It was like the last slice of pizza in a room full of hungry teenagers. Everybody wanted it, and nobody was willing to back down. The fort was under the command of Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky native with a strong sense of loyalty to the Union. But here's the kicker. The fort was surrounded by Confederate forces who had no intention of letting the Union hold onto their turf. The standoff began in December 1860, when South Carolina seceded, but the real action kicked off on April 12, 1861. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, a man with a name as grandiose as his ambitions, opened fire on Fort Sumter after Anderson refused to surrender. For 34 straight hours, the fort was bombarded with over 4,000 shells, turning it into a scene straight out of a pyrotechnics show gone wrong. Incredibly, nobody was killed during the bombardment, but the fort was reduced to a smoldering ruin, and Anderson had no choice but to surrender. The fall of Fort Sumter was the proverbial shot heard round the world, or at least across the United States. It was the moment the Civil War went from a simmer to a rolling boil. President Lincoln, not one to shy away from a challenge, called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the Southern rebellion. This was like kicking a hornet's nest. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy, bringing their count to 11. The North and South were dividing faster than a celebrity couple post-scandal. As both sides scrambled to assemble their forces, a wave of naive optimism washed over them. The Union believed they could quash the rebellion in a few months with their superior numbers, and industrial might. They had over 22 million people, a navy that could blockade southern ports like a boss, and a network of railroads stretching 22,000 miles to move troops and supplies with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The South, on the other hand, was banking on their military tradition and the fact that they were defending their home turf. They had around 9 million people, but 1/3 of that number were enslaved individuals who wouldn't be picking up muskets for the Confederate cause anytime soon. Both sides were convinced they'd be home by Christmas, an idea that was about as realistic as a unicorn riding a skateboard. The first battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, if you're talking to someone from the South, was set to be the great decider of this conflict. On July 21, 1861, the Union and Confederate armies clashed near a little creek in Virginia. It was a hot mess of a battle, with spectators from Washington picnicking on the sidelines, expecting a grand spectacle. What they got was chaos. The Union Army, led by General Irvin McDowell, was an unseasoned and green bunch, more accustomed to marching drills than actual combat. Their uniforms were a sartorial disaster, a hodgepodge of colors and styles that made them look less like a fighting force and more like an ill-organized parade. Meanwhile, the Confederate forces, commanded by Generals Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston, had their own set of problems, but managed to present a more unified front. The battle itself was an eye-opener for all involved. Both sides were unprepared for the sheer confusion and carnage that unfolded, with friendly fire incidents and tactical blunders aplenty. At one point, Union soldiers mistook a Confederate regiment for reinforcements and let them pass, only to be shot at moments later. The phrase, fog of war, might as well have been coined on that very day. As the day wore on, the Union's initial advantage crumbled, and the Confederates launched a counterattack. The legendary figure of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson emerged here, earning his nickname by standing firm in the face of Union assaults like a stone wall, inspiring his troops to hold their ground. The Union troops eventually broke ranks and fled back to Washington in a panicked rout known as the Great Skedaddle, leaving their picnic baskets and illusions of a quick victory behind. Bull Run made one thing abundantly clear. The war would be anything but brief. Both sides had underestimated their opponent and overestimated their own capabilities. The North realized they were in for a long, grueling conflict, and that their industrial resources alone wouldn't guarantee victory. The South, buoyed by their victory, believed their cause was righteous, and that they could secure independence if they just held on long enough. While both sides licked their wounds and regrouped, Lincoln got serious about finding capable military leaders. Enter George B. McClellan, a young and ambitious general who was tasked with whipping the Union's disorganized army into shape. McClellan was a master organizer and turned the ragtag troops around Washington into the well-drilled Army of the Potomac. He was also a master procrastinator, known for his reluctance to engage in battle, perpetually convinced he was outnumbered despite having superior forces. On the Confederate side, they were refining their strategies too. They knew they couldn't match the Union's manpower and resources in a prolonged conflict, so they aimed to fight a defensive war, hoping the North would tire of the cost in blood and treasure. They also sought international recognition and support, particularly from Britain and France, who were economically tied to Southern cotton. The Confederates believed that King Cotton was their trump card, a belief that would ultimately prove to be their Achilles heel. In the meantime, military tactics were undergoing a seismic shift. The Civil War was fought at a time when technology and tactics were at a crossroads. Traditional Napoleonic tactics of massed infantry charges met the harsh reality of rifled muskets and artillery capable of inflicting massive casualties at greater distances. The result was a deadly game of trial and error, as commanders on both sides learned that old strategies were about as useful as a chocolate teapot. As 1861 turned to 1862, the stage was set for a war that would drag on for 4 long years, claiming the lives of over 620,000 soldiers. It was a conflict that would reshape the nation, test its very fabric, and leave a legacy that would echo through the ages. The war was far from over, and the roller coaster ride had only just begun. The question now was not whether the house divided could stand, but at what cost could it be reunited? As 1862 bled into 1863, the American Civil War was like a game of chess played by two half-blind grandmasters, both sides making moves, some strategic, others blundering, all while grappling with the chaos of a war that refused to be neatly categorized. The nation was holding its breath, teetering on a precipice, waiting for the inevitable game-changer. Enter 1863, a year that promised to be as pivotal as a plot twist in a binge-worthy series. Let's kick things off with the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that made headlines before hashtags were even a thing. On January 1, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued this bold stroke of a pen, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be forever free. Now, don't get too carried away with visions of instant liberty. This didn't free a single slave in the loyal border states or in areas of the South already under Union control. It was more a political gambit than a moral awakening, but it did change the game. Lincoln's proclamation was a strategic masterstroke, aiming to destabilize the Confederate economy and deny them the labor force that had been propping up their war effort. It also added a moral dimension to the Union cause, giving the North a righteous glow and making it a tad more awkward for European powers to side with the Confederacy. Britain and France, both reliant on Southern cotton, had been flirting with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy, but aligning with a slave-holding rebel state now seemed about as appealing as jumping into a swimming pool filled with angry jellyfish. While the proclamation didn't free all enslaved individuals overnight, it did give the Union Army a new surge of recruits. Black men, previously barred from serving, could now join the fight for freedom, not just in theory, but in practice. By the end of the war, around 180,000 African-American soldiers had enlisted, making up roughly 10% of the Union's forces. Talk about turning the tables. These were men who had once been considered property, now wielding weapons and fighting for their own liberation. Now, let's pivot to Gettysburg, the battle that has inspired more books than there are stars in the sky, or at least that's how it feels. Often painted as the quintessential clash of titans, Gettysburg was less about gallantry and more a brutal slugfest that would leave both sides reeling. From July 1 to July 3, 1863, the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, found itself the unlikely stage for the war's bloodiest battle. General Robert E. Lee, buoyed by a string of Confederate victories, was pushing north, hoping a decisive win on Union soil would force the North to negotiate peace. It was a Hail Mary pass, and like most Hail Marys, it was a gamble. Over 160,000 soldiers converged on Gettysburg, turning the fields into a chaotic tableau of smoke, blood, and fury. The Union's Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General George G. Meade, was tasked with stopping Lee's advance. For 3 days, the armies clashed, with the high water mark of the Confederacy coming on the third day in the form of Pickett's charge. Imagine 500 Confederate soldiers marching across an open field under relentless Union fire, hoping to break the enemy line. The result? A spectacular failure, with over half of those men killed, wounded, or captured. It was a desperate act that underscored the harsh reality of war. Gallantry was often just another word for tragic futility. The numbers were staggering. The Battle of Gettysburg resulted in approximately 51,000 casualties, a figure that could fill a modern sports stadium. It was a turning point in the war, marking the beginning of the end for the Confederacy's hopes of victory. Lee's army limped back to Virginia, the myth of Southern invincibility shattered like glass. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and the South's dream of independence slipped further from its grasp. Meanwhile, the North was riding high on the victory, but it wasn't all sunshine and roses. The Union might have won the battle, but the war was far from over. The harsh reality was setting in that it would take more than just a few battlefield wins to bring the Confederacy to its knees. The war was draining the Union's coffers faster than a leaky bucket, costing approximately $2, $5 million per day. Lincoln and his administration had to keep the home front engaged, and the soldiers supplied, a task akin to juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. In the gritty trenches of reality, both sides faced the unglamorous tasks of logistics and supply lines. The North had the advantage here, with its extensive railway network and industrial output. Railroads were the lifeblood of the Union war effort, transporting troops, weapons, and supplies across vast distances. The South, less industrialized, and with a rail network that resembled a patchwork quilt, struggled to keep its armies fed and armed. The romantic image of the noble Southern soldier was undercut by the harsh truth of inadequate supplies and dwindling resources. As we peel back the layers of myth and legend, it's clear that the war was as much about grit and grind as it was about glory. The romantic notion of Southern gallantry clashed with the stark realities of war. Starvation, disease, and the ever-present specter of death haunted the Confederate ranks. The North, often portrayed as an unstoppable juggernaut, faced its own challenges, from draft riots in New York City to political infighting in Washington. Yet, despite the mud, blood, and bureaucracy, the war slogged on, each side hoping for a breakthrough that remained tantalizingly out of reach. The question wasn't just who would win, but who could endure, who could adapt to the new realities of modern warfare, where technology and strategy were reshaping the battlefield. As 1863 wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a war of numbers or tactics, but of wills. The Union's resolve was bolstered by key victories in the Western theater, where General Ulysses S. Grant was making a name for himself. His capture of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, was a masterclass in siege warfare and effectively split the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River. This wasn't just a tactical win. It was a strategic body blow that crippled Confederate supply lines and morale. Meanwhile, in the Eastern theater, the war ground on, with both sides locked in a deadly stalemate. The myth of the war's glamour was continually chipped away by the relentless grind of reality. Disease claimed more lives than bullets, and the romanticized notion of a quick, heroic campaign was as dead as the dodo. Soldiers on both sides were learning the harsh truth of war. It was long, it was grueling, and it was anything but glorious. The Civil War, by 1863, was a crucible that tested the mettle of a nation. It was a time of transformation, where ideals were put to the ultimate test, and the old ways were swept aside by the relentless tide of progress. The messy middle of the conflict was where the war's outcome began to tilt, where the stakes were raised, and where the battle for the soul of the nation was truly joined. As we leave 1863 behind, the stage is set for the final acts of this epic saga. The Union was gaining momentum, but the Confederacy, though battered, wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. The nation was bracing for the next chapter as the war continued to rage, reshaping the American landscape and leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages. The roller coaster ride wasn't over, and the journey to reunification was far from complete. As 1863 faded into the annals of history, the American Civil War was still a beast with no clear leash. The Union had won significant victories, but the Confederates were still holding on with the tenacity of a cat clinging to the curtains. Enter 1864, a year that promised to either break the stalemate or break the nation. Abraham Lincoln, the man in the tall hat who had somehow managed to keep his head above water in this political whirlpool, was now eyeing the finish line like a marathon runner with a cramp. But first, he needed to navigate the treacherous waters of re-election in a nation less united than a family reunion after a monopoly game. In the political arena, Lincoln was playing chess, while everyone else was still figuring out checkers. He knew he needed a decisive military victory to bolster his chances of keeping the White House. Enter Ulysses S. Grant, a man who looked more like a scruffy prospector than a military genius, but who had a knack for turning the tide of battle. Promoted to lieutenant general, Grant was handed the keys to the Union's entire military machine. His strategy, simple: hammer the Confederate armies until they shattered, like a sledgehammer to a porcelain vase. While Grant moved to engage Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman took charge of the Union forces in the West. Now, Sherman wasn't exactly the kind of guy you'd invite to a garden party. He had a reputation for being as subtle as a sledgehammer and twice as determined. His mission: march from Chattanooga to Atlanta and cut a swath through the South that would make the Union's presence felt like an unwelcome guest at a family dinner. This was total war, a new brand of conflict where civilian infrastructure was as much a target as enemy troops. Sherman's infamous march to the sea began in May 1864, and it was less a military campaign and more a rolling thunderstorm of destruction. His men cut a path of ruin 60 miles wide, scorching the earth like a giant, angry toddler with a magnifying glass. Over 300 miles later, they reached Savannah in December, leaving behind a trail of burnt crops, dismantled railroads, and shattered Southern morale. It was a brutal strategy, but it worked. Sherman's march was the death knell for the Confederate economy, as effective as a scalpel and as blunt as a club. Back in the political theater, Lincoln faced the Democratic challenger, George B. McClellan, the very general he'd once fired for being as slow as molasses in January. McClellan ran on a platform that included negotiating peace with the Confederacy, which was about as popular in the North as a rainstorm at a barbecue. But Lincoln had an ace up his sleeve: Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864. This victory was the political booster shot Lincoln needed, convincing the Northern public that the end of the war was in sight, and re-electing him was the way to get there. Meanwhile, Grant was engaged in a relentless campaign against Lee in Virginia. This was less about grand, sweeping victories, and more about wearing the Confederates down, one bloody encounter at a time. The Overland Campaign, as it was known, featured battles with names like the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, places where the casualty lists ran so long they could make a grown man weep. In one particularly grim encounter at Cold Harbor, nearly 7,000 Union soldiers were cut down in less than an hour, a sobering reminder that even victory came at a steep cost. Grant's tactics were clear: keep Lee's forces pinned down while Sherman wreaked havoc in the South. It was a war of attrition, a grim calculus, where the Union's superior numbers and resources were slowly grinding the Confederacy into dust. But the Confederates weren't going down without a fight. Lee, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, was still a master tactician, playing a defensive game that would have made any chess grandmaster proud. As the year drew to a close, the Confederacy was teetering on the edge of collapse. Its economy was in shambles, its armies were bleeding men faster than they could replace them, and its leaders were running out of options. The South's currency was about as valuable as monopoly money. Inflation was running rampant, and basic supplies were harder to come by than a quiet Friday night in a college town. The dream of Southern independence was slipping away, like sand through their fingers. The final act of this bloody drama came in 1865. Sherman, having turned Savannah into a Union Christmas present, now set his sights northward, toward the Carolinas. His march was as relentless as ever, leaving a trail of ashes and despair. The South's infrastructure was crumbling faster than a sandcastle at high tide. Railroads, factories, and farms were all fair game in Sherman's campaign of destruction. Meanwhile, Grant was closing in on Lee in Virginia. The siege of Petersburg stretched on for 9 grueling months, with both sides entrenched in a deadly stalemate, reminiscent of a grim dance where neither partner could quite let go. But the Union's resources were like a bottomless well, while the Confederacy was scraping the bottom of an ever-dwindling barrel. The end came with the dramatic flair befitting such a monumental conflict. On April 9, 1865, in a small town with a name as unassuming as a worn-out shoe, Appomattox courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. The terms were generous, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and promising no trials for treason. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a nod to a future where the nation might heal its wounds, though the scars would linger. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. A war that had torn the country apart was ending with handshakes and signed documents in a modest Virginia parlor. Lee, the Southern gentleman, and Grant, the scruffy Union bulldog, had brought the curtain down on the bloodiest chapter in American history. It was a climax that was as understated as it was profound. But lest we forget, the drama wasn't quite over. Just days after the surrender, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, an actor with delusions of grandeur. It was a cruel twist of fate, robbing the nation of its leader just as it was beginning to find its footing on the path to recovery. Lincoln's death was a national tragedy that underscored the cost of the war, not just in lives, but in the potential for a smoother reconciliation. The war's endgame had been a complex dance of strategy, politics, and sheer willpower. The Union had emerged victorious, but the road ahead was fraught with challenges. The task of rebuilding the nation, of reconciling the North and South, was as daunting as the conflict that had preceded it. The Civil War had ended, but the struggle to unite a fractured country was only just beginning. And yet, the story of how a divided nation stitched itself back together again was a tale for another day, leaving the pages open for the next chapter in America's turbulent saga. So, the Civil War had ended, but the real challenge was just beginning: Reconstruction. Picture a country that's been through a messy breakup, trying to piece itself back together without a clear idea of how to make the patchwork quilt of the Union look whole again. It was like assembling IKEA furniture without instructions, frustrating, confusing, and with a few missing screws. The story of Reconstruction is a bit like a roller coaster ride where you think the twists and turns are over, only to find yourself dangling upside down. The nation had to figure out how to rebuild the South, integrate millions of newly freed African Americans, and mend a political fabric that had been shredded by years of war. It was a tall order, akin to asking a cat to walk a tightrope, passable but fraught with peril. Enter the Reconstruction Amendments, the legislative attempts to recalibrate the moral compass of the nation. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, was the first to take center stage, abolishing slavery in the United States. With one stroke, it declared slavery obsolete, a notion that was both revolutionary and long overdue. Yet, the amendment was more than just a legal adjustment. It was a seismic shift in how America defined liberty and justice. Imagine the nation finally acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, human bondage wasn't the best way to go about things. Next up was the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people. It was like handing out the keys to a club that should have been open to everyone all along. The 14th Amendment also promised equal protection of the laws, a phrase that would become the bedrock for countless civil rights battles in the future. It was the legal equivalent of setting up a tent in a storm, flimsy but essential for shelter against the winds of injustice. Then came the 15th Amendment in 1870, a bold declaration that race, color, or previous condition of servitude couldn't be used to deny voting rights. In theory, it was a masterstroke for democracy. In practice, it was about as effective as a chocolate teapot. Southern states quickly found creative ways to sidestep these new rules, employing literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation to keep African Americans away from the ballot box. It was a classic case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. All these amendments painted a picture of progress, but they were like shiny new paint on a crumbling wall. The South's economy was in tatters, its infrastructure wrecked, and the social order flipped on its head. The period from 1865 to 1877 was a chaotic mix of hope and despair, progress and regression. You had the rise of the Freedmen's Bureau, designed to help former slaves transition to freedom, set against the backdrop of emerging groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who were less about robes and more about terror. Politics during Reconstruction was a circus without a ringmaster. Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination, was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party with the radical Republicans in Congress. They wanted a more aggressive approach to rebuilding the South and protecting the rights of freedmen, while Johnson's lenient policies seemed more like a slap on the wrist than a firm hand. It was a political tug-of-war that resulted in Johnson being impeached, though he was acquitted by a single vote. Talk about drama. This was a political soap opera without the commercial breaks. Economically, the South was trying to find its feet on a shaky foundation. The old plantation system was gone, but the new sharecropping system was hardly a step forward. It was more like a lateral shuffle, binding freedmen and poor whites to the land with debt as their chains. Cotton was still king, but the throne was wobbly, and the economic disparity between North and South remained as stark as ever. The South was a region trying to reinvent itself, but the shadows of the past were like gum stuck to its shoe, hard to shake off, and a constant reminder of where it had been. As for the myths that linger, the idea of the lost cause emerged, a romanticized vision of the Confederacy as a noble albeit doomed, endeavor. This narrative painted Southern leaders as tragic heroes and the war as a gallant fight for states' rights, conveniently glossing over the inconvenient truth of slavery. It was like looking at history through rose-tinted glasses, only to find the glasses cracked and the view distorted. Reconstruction's legacy is a mixed bag. It laid the groundwork for civil rights advancements, yet its failures set the stage for the Jim Crow era, a period of legalized segregation and disenfranchisement that would last until the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century. It was a time of great potential and missed opportunities, showing that progress is often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes a step sideways into a puddle. So, did anyone really win the Civil War? The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the United States began a slow, often painful journey toward a more inclusive society. But the war left behind scars deeper than the Grand Canyon, and the nation would spend the next century grappling with its legacy. The romantic notion of a united country was marred by the realities of division and prejudice that stubbornly refused to fade. The Civil War and Reconstruction were chapters in a story that is still being written, a saga of struggle, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of a more perfect union. The war's shadow stretches long, casting light on the triumphs and tragedies that have shaped America's identity. It remains a testament to the nation's ability to rise from the ashes and a reminder that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing journey, not a destination. As we close the book on this chapter of history, it's clear that the lessons of the Civil War, about humanity, equality, and the cost of division, are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. The echoes of the past continue to reverberate, urging us to remember, reflect, and strive for a future where the ideals of liberty and justice for all are not just promises, but realities. Marie Curie wasn't just a trailblazer. She was a full-on science juggernaut, powered by sheer grit and a diet that can only be described as tragically minimalist. Born in Warsaw, Poland, in 1867, she entered a world where women in science were about as rare as a solar eclipse. Her early years were spent in a family of educators, which meant she was probably the kid who actually liked going to school. Her father, W. Ladislaw Skłodowski, was a math and physics teacher, and her mother, Bronislawa, ran a prestigious boarding school for girls. You could say Marie had education in her DNA, but let's not pretend her path was paved with rose petals. Poland at the time was under the thumb of the Russian Empire, which was about as fun as it sounds. The Russians were particularly fond of making life difficult for the Polish, especially in education. Schools were forced to teach in Russian, and Polish culture was suppressed at every turn. Marie's father lost his job for harboring pro-Polish sentiments, which, translated into modern terms, means he was too patriotic for his own good. The family fell on hard times, and young Marie had to fight for her education tooth and nail. Fast forward a few years, and we find Marie as a top student, but with nowhere to go. You see, the University of Warsaw didn't admit women, because apparently the idea of a woman with a degree was just too radical. What's a brilliant young woman to do? Enter the floating university, a clandestine setup where women like Marie could get their learn on without the pesky interference of gender discrimination. It was like Fight Club, but with more textbooks and less Brad Pitt. By the 1890, Marie had had enough of Warsaw's academic glass ceiling and took her talents to Paris. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, the intellectual mecca where the air was thick with ideas and the occasional whiff of existential dread. But Paris wasn't all croissants and café culture for Marie. Her student life was the epitome of frugality. She subsisted on bread and tea, which is probably why she could fit into Parisian doorways without turning sideways. Her living quarters, a damp attic. Yes, the same kind of place where you might store old furniture or hide from creditors. But for Marie, it was a makeshift lab. This was no cozy garret. We're talking about a space with all the charm of a dungeon and none of the square footage. It's a wonder she didn't melt into a puddle of despair, but Marie was made of sterner stuff. Despite the squalor, Marie was on a mission. She earned a degree in physics in 1893, followed by a degree in mathematics the next year. It was like she was collecting degrees like some people collect stamps. And while we're at it, let's debunk a myth. Marie wasn't an instant celebrity. Her early work didn't exactly make her the darling of the scientific community. In fact, her groundbreaking research on radioactivity, yes, she coined that term, was initially met with polite indifference. But that's jumping ahead a bit. Back to Paris, where Marie met a fellow scientist named Pierre Curie. He was a physicist with a penchant for crystals, electromagnetism, and, as luck would have it, Marie. They married in 1895, and let's just say their honeymoon was more lab than love nest. Their shared passion for science was the real romance here. Forget candlelit dinners. These two were busy discovering the secrets of the universe. Marie's early years in Paris were a mix of groundbreaking research and relentless poverty. Imagine working with radium and polonium in a lab that was basically a glorified shed. Marie and Pierre managed to isolate radium in 1902, which was no small feat. It was like finding a needle in a haystack, except the needle was radioactive and the haystack was the periodic table. So, why does any of this matter? Because Marie didn't just break the glass ceiling. She obliterated it with a radioactive sledgehammer. Her early years are a testament to the power of perseverance, brains, and a willingness to endure conditions that would make a Spartan wince. And let's not overlook her contribution to science. 2 Nobel Prizes, the first in physics in 1903, shared with Pierre and Henry Becquerel, and the second in chemistry in 1911, all her own. But those accolades were still in the future. As the 1890s drew to a close, Marie had already started rewriting the rules of science and society, 1 cup of tea and crust of bread at a time. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin in the most unlikely of places, like a damp attic in Paris. Marie Curie was settling into her new Parisian life of scientific rigor and questionable living conditions when she met Pierre Curie, a fellow scientist who was as enamored with her intellect as he was with the burgeoning field of radioactivity. Now, Pierre wasn't your run-of-the-mill academic. He was a physicist already making waves with his work on magnetism. But let's be honest, if you think their union was all about candlelight and Parisian romance, you've been bamboozled by Hollywood. Their love story was less La La Land and more Breaking Bad, minus the meth lab. The Curies tied the knot in 1895, and thus began one of the most productive partnerships in scientific history. Their honeymoon, you guessed it, right back to the lab. Forget sunsets and sandy beaches. These two were busy discovering elements. They were the original couple goals for anyone who finds words like polonium romantic. Their lab, if you can call it that, was more like a derelict shack that would make modern health and safety officers break out in a cold sweat. The place had all the charm of a broom closet and about as much ventilation. In 1898, the dynamic duo discovered polonium, an element named after Marie's homeland of Poland. Romantic, right. Except, of course, for the fact that polonium is about as friendly as a cornered rattlesnake. It's highly radioactive and was later used in some less than noble endeavors, like poisoning spies. But back in 1898, it was a groundbreaking find. You see, polonium wasn't just another addition to the periodic table. It was a stepping stone to their more famous discovery, radium. Ah, radium. The element that would make them household names and redefine the boundaries of science. But let's not gloss over the small detail that isolating radium was the scientific equivalent of finding a needle in a radioactive haystack. Marie and Pierre spent countless hours stirring huge vats of pitchblende, a uranium-rich mineral, in their makeshift lab. Imagine trying to extract a single precious gem from a mountain of rubble, except the rubble could give you radiation sickness. Spoiler alert. They succeeded in 1902, managing to isolate 1/10 of a gram of radium chloride from a ton of pitchblende. That's right, a ton. Talk about dedication, or maybe just a lack of other hobbies. Now, let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of their work environment. The Curies' lab was so hazardous, it could have doubled as the set for a horror movie. No proper ventilation, no protective gear, and certainly no awareness of the long-term effects of radiation. This was a time when the dangers of radioactivity were as mysterious as the dark side of the moon. They handled these materials with bare hands, blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the ticking time bomb in their midst. It's no wonder that Marie later suffered from health issues likely linked to her exposure. But hey, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, right? Or in this case, without risking a few radiological ailments. The Curie's work was nothing short of revolutionary. Radium's discovery had a seismic impact on science and medicine. Suddenly, here was a substance that glowed in the dark and could seemingly snuff out tumors. Radium became the darling of the medical world, hailed as a miracle cure for all sorts of ailments. It was even making its way into consumer products, radium-infused water, toothpaste, and wristwatches. Yes, people thought it was a good idea to brush their teeth with radioactivity. Sometimes, truth really is stranger than fiction. But before you start thinking of Marie and Pierre as mad scientists, remember that their work fundamentally changed our understanding of atomic physics. They were at the forefront of a scientific revolution that would lead to advances far beyond their wildest dreams or nightmares. Their discoveries would open the door to nuclear physics, ushering in an era of both incredible medical breakthroughs and the looming specter of nuclear warfare. So, while their lab might have been a death trap, it was also a crucible for modern science. Their partnership was the stuff of legend, but let's not kid ourselves. It was also a pragmatic alliance. They were two brilliant minds working in tandem, driven by a shared obsession to unravel the mysteries of the universe. Their love for each other was genuine, but it was their shared passion for science that truly defined their relationship. They were less Romeo and Juliet, more Watson and Crick, if Watson and Crick had been married and worked without the benefit of radiation shielding. Marie and Pierre's story is a testament to the power of collaboration, but it's also a reminder of the human cost of scientific progress. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible, often at great personal risk. Theirs was a world where the thrill of discovery was tempered by the harsh realities of their working conditions. And while we can romanticize their achievements, we should also acknowledge the sacrifices they made. Sometimes, the pursuit of knowledge demands more than just intellectual rigor. It requires a willingness to face the unknown, no matter the cost. As we leave Marie and Pierre in their lab, surrounded by the glow of their discoveries, let's remember that history is rarely as neat and tidy as we like to believe. Their story is one of triumph and tragedy, dedication and danger. It's a reminder that even the most groundbreaking achievements come with their own set of challenges, and sometimes those challenges are as radioactive as the elements they discovered. But that's a story for another day. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the life and legacy of Marie Curie, one radioactive element at a time. And so, we leave Marie and Pierre Curie in their lab, glowing, literally and metaphorically, with the success of their groundbreaking discoveries. But as it turns out, the universe had a few more surprises in store for Marie, the kind that would catapult her from the cramped confines of their hazardous lab into the glaring spotlight of international fame. You see, the early 1900s were a peculiar time when scientific breakthroughs were starting to get the rock star treatment. Who knew radium would be the stairway to heaven of elements? Enter the Nobel Prizes, the Oscars of the scientific community. In 1903, Marie and Pierre shared the Nobel Prize in Physics with Henry Becquerel, the guy who initially stumbled upon the phenomenon of radioactivity. It was kind of like splitting a Grammy with the person who invented the recording studio. Now, the Nobel Committee wasn't just being generous. They were acknowledging that Marie's work was a scientific game-changer. However, let's not get too misty-eyed about this accolade. The Nobel Committee almost forgot to include Marie's name in the nomination, which sounds like an administrative oversight or maybe just a classic case of gender bias. It took an intervention by a Swedish mathematician, Gösta Middagläffler, to ensure she got the recognition she deserved. Not exactly a knight in shining armor, but hey, sometimes you take what you can get. Marie's reaction to winning, practically a shrug. She wasn't in it for the fame. She once said, "In science, we must be interested in things, not in persons." Basically, she was too busy splitting atoms to worry about splitting hairs over public opinion. But whether she liked it or not, the award made Marie a household name, a bona fide celebrity in a world where the idea of a female scientist was still as foreign as Wi-Fi in the Stone Age. Winning the Nobel Prize was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it opened doors to funding and further research opportunities. On the other, it also opened the floodgates of media scrutiny. The press was all over her like electrons on a nucleus, fascinated by this petite Polish woman who was not only a scientific genius, but also the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. And here's where the plot thickens. Marie had to navigate this newfound fame while dodging the era's rampant sexism. Journalists were more interested in her wardrobe than her work, asking questions as insightful as the nutritional content of a rice cake. One contemporary newspaper described her as a lady of fragile health and reserved demeanor, which is code for "we have no idea how she does it, so we'll focus on her looks instead." Despite the media circus, Marie was not one to rest on her laurels or her lab coat. She continued her research with the tenacity of a dog with a bone, proving that she wasn't just Pierre's sidekick, but a formidable scientist in her own right. In 1911, she bagged her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for her discovery of radium and polonium and her advancements in understanding radioactivity. That made her the first person ever to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different scientific fields. Take that, haters. Now, you'd think a double Nobel laureate would be universally celebrated, right? Wrong. The second Nobel Prize came at a time when Marie was embroiled in a scandal that had all the makings of a tabloid sensation. The scandal involved Paul Langevin, a fellow scientist and a married man with whom Marie was rumored to have had an affair. Cue the moral panic. The French press went wild, portraying her as a foreign seductress who was here to steal not just hearts, but also husbands. Never mind her genius, the headlines were more like a soap opera than scientific journalism. Amidst the media frenzy, Marie remained unflappable. She attended the Nobel ceremony despite advice to stay away, proving that she was as audacious as she was brilliant. Her speech at the Nobel banquet was a masterclass in focus and defiance, ignoring the scandal entirely and talking instead about her scientific work. Meanwhile, the Nobel Committee, which had been so indecisive about her initial nomination, now had to stand by their decision to award her. Scandal be damned. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Marie, but for women in science everywhere. She was showing that personal attacks and societal prejudices wouldn't derail her dedication to her work. Marie's story during this period is a fascinating blend of scientific achievement and social struggle. She was breaking barriers at a time when women were supposed to be seen and not heard, preferably in the kitchen, not the lab. It's hard to overstate the courage it took for her to persist in the face of such adversity. Yet, through it all, she remained surprisingly nonchalant about her accolades. When asked how she felt about her success, she famously quipped, "One never notices what has been done. One can only see what remains to be done." Talk about having your eye on the prize, or, in her case, the next research paper. Marie Curie's rise to fame is a testament to her resilience and brilliance. She navigated the choppy waters of early 20th century gender politics with a grace that belied the storm around her. She wasn't just a scientist. She was a pioneer, a trailblazer who opened the door for future generations of women in science. Her story challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what it means to be a genius and a woman in a male-dominated field. Even as we celebrate her achievements, we must also acknowledge the personal cost of her dedication. But hold on, the story doesn't end here. Marie's life was far from a fairy tale, and in the chapters to come, we'll delve into the complex legacy she left behind. From the trenches of World War I to the corridors of academia, Marie Curie continued to push boundaries and defy expectations. Her journey is a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary lives are forged in the crucible of adversity. So, stay tuned as we continue to unravel the life and legacy of Marie Curie, a woman who was as unstoppable as the elements she discovered. As the dust settled from her second Nobel Prize and the scandal that came with it, Marie Curie found herself at yet another crossroads. While she could have easily spent her days basking in scientific glory, life had other plans. Enter World War I, a conflict that would drag her out of the academic ivory tower and into the muddy, chaotic trenches of emergency medicine. Now, if you think Marie was about to let a little thing like a world war keep her from contributing her 2 cents, or rather, her 2 Nobel Prizes worth, you'd be sorely mistaken. With Europe engulfed in turmoil by 1914, Marie's scientific endeavors took a backseat to her burgeoning sense of duty. She wasn't the type to sit back and watch the world burn while sipping tea from a lead-lined cup. No, Marie was determined to make a difference, and she had a bright idea: X-rays. Of course, this was back when X-rays were still a novelty, not the routine medical marvel we take for granted today. She saw the potential to use this technology on the battlefield to locate shrapnel in wounded soldiers, essentially giving medical teams a fighting chance to save lives. So, what did Marie do? She rolled up her sleeves, metaphorically and literally, and got to work. She spearheaded the development of mobile X-ray units, affectionately dubbed Little Curries. These weren't just any old mobile units. They were essentially the first battle-ready radiological labs on wheels. Imagine a cross between a modern-day ambulance and a science lab, minus the GPS and air conditioning. Marie managed to secure funding to equip 20 of these rolling lifesavers, which sounds impressive until you consider the sheer scale of the war. Think of it as trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. But hey, you've got to start somewhere. These mobile units were a logistical masterpiece. Each little Curie was equipped with a dynamo-powered X-ray machine, photographic darkroom equipment, and an array of medical supplies. Marie even took the initiative to train a slew of young women as radiology assistants, because who run the world? Girls, apparently, with a little help from radioactive elements. But here's where the story takes a humorous twist. Marie might have been a scientific genius, but not every military doctor was cut from the same intellectual cloth. Some of these medics were about as familiar with X-ray technology as most of us are with quantum physics. This led to some unintentionally hilarious situations where these brave, yet bewildered, doctors attempted to operate machinery that seemed more alien than helpful. Picture a doctor trying to figure out an X-ray machine like your grandpa trying to set up a new smartphone. The learning curve was steeper than a Parisian rooftop. Despite the initial hiccups, Marie's efforts were nothing short of revolutionary. By the end of the war, over 1 million soldiers had been examined using X-rays, and her mobile units had performed 200,000 examinations. That's right, 1 million soldiers. Marie didn't just contribute to the war effort. She saved countless lives, proving that the pen, or in this case the X-ray, is mightier than the sword. Now, let's talk numbers. Marie managed to pull this off with a budget tighter than a pair of pre-war trousers. The French government, never one to open its purse strings too wide, allocated just enough francs to cover the essentials. Marie, ever the pragmatist, stretched every centime like it was made of elastic. She even donated her own Nobel Prize medals to the war effort, a gesture that was both noble and, let's face it, a bit tragic. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. The economic context here is crucial. Europe was bleeding money faster than it was shedding soldiers. Resources were scarce, and every contribution counted, especially one from a double Nobel laureate who was willing to dig in and get her hands dirty. Her work during the war was a testament to her ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Marie wasn't just a scientist. She was a problem solver par excellence, with a knack for turning theoretical knowledge into practical solutions. But let's not sugarcoat this. Marie's stint as a wartime heroine wasn't a romantic escapade filled with gallant soldiers and triumphant fanfare. Far from it. The reality was harsh, gritty, and downright exhausting. She spent hours on end in makeshift hospitals, dodging the chaos and carnage that surrounded her. Yet, through it all, Marie remained as resilient as ever. Her commitment to the cause was unwavering, and her ability to maintain her composure in the face of adversity was nothing short of remarkable. Marie Curie's World War I efforts showcased a side of her that was just as determined and ingenious as the one that discovered radium. Her work with the Little Curries was a pioneering step in medical radiology and a shining example of how science can serve humanity even in its darkest hours. So, while the war may have been a time of unprecedented destruction, it also highlighted the indomitable spirit of individuals like Marie Curie, who refused to stand idle in the face of catastrophe. As the war drew to a close, Marie had not only contributed immeasurably to the medical field, but had also solidified her legacy as a trailblazer who transcended the boundaries of science, gender, and circumstance. Her story during this period is a vivid reminder that even in the bleakest of times, a single determined individual can make a world of difference. But hold onto your Geiger counters, folks, because Marie's journey was far from over. There were still many more elements to explore and challenges to conquer, both in the lab and beyond. Now, if you thought Marie Curie's story ended with her trotting off into the sunset with a couple of Nobel Prizes and a war hero badge, you'd be missing the punchline. Her legacy is more like a long-running series with plot twists that would make a screenwriter jealous. So, let's dive into the sequel of her life, the one where her discoveries echo through the halls of modern science, while people scramble to separate fact from the fiction that her mythos has generated. Firstly, let's talk about radium, that little superstar of the periodic table that Marie helped put on the map. Back in the early 20th century, radium was like the Swiss Army knife of elements. Got a tumor? Radium. Want to take your glow-in-the-dark watch for a spin? Radium. Fancy a radium-infused tonic to boost your vitality? Why not? The element was hailed as a miracle cure, promising everything short of eternal life. Companies cashed in on the craze, selling radium-laced products with all the enthusiasm of a snake oil salesman at a carnival. It was like the health fad equivalent of a 90s boy band, everywhere, and not necessarily good for you. Here's the kicker. Radium is radioactive. That tiny detail seemed to escape the notice of the public and manufacturers caught up in radium fever. The element's glow, which dazzled those early 20th century eyes, was actually a warning sign screaming danger in neon lights. Fast forward a couple of decades, and radium's reputation went from miracle cure to cautionary tale faster than you can say lead apron. The Radium Girls, factory workers who painted watch dials with radium paint, paid the ultimate price, their tragic fate a grim reminder that not all that glitters is gold or safe for human consumption. So, what did Marie Curie think of this radioactive roller coaster? Well, she was never one to bask in the glow of public opinion, pun intended. Marie was focused on the science, driven by curiosity rather than commercial interests. She once remarked, "I am among those who think that science has great beauty." For her, radium was a pathway to understanding the atomic world, not a ticket to the latest health trend. And despite the later fallout from radium's misuse, her work laid the foundation for radiation therapy, a cornerstone of modern cancer treatment. Her discoveries were like a double-edged sword, offering the potential to save lives while serving as a stark lesson in the importance of scientific caution. Now, let's shift gears and talk legacy. Marie Curie didn't just leave a mark. She left a crater-sized impact on the world of science. Her relentless pursuit of knowledge opened doors for women in STEM fields, smashing through barriers like a radioactive wrecking ball. Today, women scientists owe a debt to Marie's trailblazing determination, though it's worth noting that gender equality in science is still a work in progress. The numbers are climbing, but as of 2023, women make up about 30% of researchers globally. Progress, yes, but still room for improvement. Marie would likely be the first to say, keep pushing the frontiers, but don't forget to check your Geiger counter. And oh, the myths. Marie's life has been romanticized and dramatized more times than Shakespeare's plays. From Hollywood biopics to educational documentaries, she's been painted as everything from a scientific saint to a tragic heroine. The truth, she was a complex figure, a woman who balanced brilliance with a sometimes abrasive personality, driven by her work, but not immune to the challenges of her era. She wasn't a saint or a sinner, just a human, like the rest of us, albeit one with a slightly better grasp of radioactive decay. Popular culture has taken a shine to Marie, and why not? Her life is a narrative goldmine. She's been immortalized in films, with actresses from Greer Garson to Rosamund Pike stepping into her lab coat. There's even a Marie Curie action figure, complete with a mini periodic table, proving that the thirst for scientific role models is alive and well. But let's not lose sight of the genuine article amidst the plastic and celluloid. Marie was remarkable not because she fit into the mold of a hero, but because she shattered it, all while wearing a modest skirt and a stern expression. As we wrap up this tale of radioactive discovery and enduring legacy, it's crucial to acknowledge the economic and social tides Marie navigated. She lived through a tumultuous era where scientific funding was as fickle as a cat on a hot tin roof, and societal norms were about as flexible as a steel rod. Yet she persisted, driven by a curiosity that was insatiable and a work ethic that was practically Herculean. Her life is a testament to the idea that greatness often requires a healthy dose of stubbornness and a willingness to take the path less trodden, even if it's lined with pitchblende and prejudice. So, as you tuck into bed, ponder this. Marie Curie's legacy isn't just about the radium or the Nobel Prizes, though those are pretty flashy highlights. It's about her unyielding quest for knowledge and the doors she opened for future generations. Her story is a reminder that even in a world that often tells us to sit down and stay quiet, there are those who stand up and speak volumes with their actions. Marie Curie didn't just write a chapter in the book of science. She authored an entire volume, and for that, the world is immeasurably richer. If you think your social media feed is overwhelming, try stepping into the Tang Dynasty circa 618 AD, where Lai Yuan decided to reboot China like some kind of ancient tech support guru. And boy, did he hit the jackpot. This was the era where the party never stopped, and neither did the poetry. It was the golden age of China's cultural renaissance, a time when picking up a quill could make you a celebrity faster than an Instagram influencer with a viral dance challenge. Lai Yuan, later known as Emperor Geazu of Tang, was the guy who thought, you know what this country needs? A makeover. And he did just that by founding the Tang Dynasty. Imagine the entire nation getting a fresh coat of paint, only this paint was made of poetry, innovation, and a sprinkle of political savvy. The Tang Dynasty was a big deal. We're talking a cultural explosion that made even the Renaissance in Europe look like a warm-up act. These guys were innovating before it was cool, and they had the economy to back it up. You see, someone had to foot the bill for all those lavish ink brushes and luxurious silk scrolls. Enter the economic boom, thanks to the Silk Road trade, agricultural advancements, and a little something called the equal field system, which was their version of land reform. But let's talk about the real celebrities of the Tang Dynasty, the poets. If you ever thought poetry was just about pretty words, think again. These wordsmiths were rock stars, and they wielded their quills like swords. Lai Bai, for instance, was the kind of guy who'd challenge you to a drinking contest and then write a poem about it on the spot. His works were filled with such vivid imagery and emotion that they practically leapt off the paper. He had a flair for the dramatic, often writing about the joys and sorrows of life while sipping wine under the moonlight. It was all very romantic, but beneath the surface, his poetry was also a subtle critique of society and politics. Then there's Du Fu, who was less about the party and more about the politics. His poems were like a Twitter feed of the Tang Dynasty, highlighting the struggles and hardships of the common people. Du Fu wasn't afraid to call out the ruling class, and his works often reflected the turmoil of the times. He was like the Bob Dylan of ancient China, singing the blues about war, famine, and the plight of the poor. But unlike Dylan, Du Fu didn't have the luxury of electric guitars, just a brush and ink. Now, don't get it twisted. These poets weren't just writing for kicks. Their words carried weight, influencing political thought and social norms. Poetry was the medium through which ideas traveled faster than a viral tweet. The Tang Dynasty valued poetry so much that it became a part of the civil service exam. That's right. If you wanted a job in the government, you better know your stanzas from your metaphors. It was the ultimate litmus test for intelligence and culture. Economically, the Tang Dynasty was like a well-oiled machine, humming along thanks to a currency system that could make modern economists weep with envy. Copper coins were the order of the day, and they kept trade flowing smoothly. The Silk Road was the Amazon prime of its time, bringing goods from as far as Rome and Persia and spreading Chinese culture in return. This trade network wasn't just about silk and spices. It was about ideas and innovation. It was the information superhighway of the ancient world, minus the cat videos. Of course, we can't ignore the less glamorous side of this cultural renaissance. For every lie by living it up, there were countless anonymous artisans and laborers making it all possible. The Tang Dynasty's grandeur was built on the backs of those who toiled in the fields, crafted the ink, and wove the silk. It was a society of stark contrasts, opulence and poverty, enlightenment and repression. Yet it was these very contradictions that fueled the creative fire of the Tang poets. So there you have it, the Tang Dynasty, where poetry was power, and power was poetry. It was a time when words could topple empires or build them up, and when a well-placed metaphor was worth more than gold. As we dive deeper into this era, remember that the beauty of the Tang Dynasty lies not just in its art, but in its ability to capture the human experience in all its messy, imperfect glory. Now, isn't that a thought worth pondering over a cup of tea? Or maybe something stronger, if you're channeling your inner Lai Bai. Now, let's shift our gaze to the Tang Dynasty's cultural cauldron, where the Silk Road served as the grand artery through which the lifeblood of ideas, fashion, and yes, even bizarre culinary experiments flowed freely. Picture it as the internet of the 7th century, minus the phishing scams and cat memes. This was the era when China threw open its doors to the world, or at least to anyone who could navigate a camel across deserts and mountains. The Silk Road was like a cosmic superhighway stretching over 4,000 miles, connecting Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, to the far reaches of Persia and beyond. This wasn't just a dusty trail for caravans laden with silk and spices. Oh no, my dear friend, it was a bustling marketplace for the mind. Ideas zipped along the route as fast as a rumor at a family gathering. From fashion to religion, nothing was immune to the irresistible allure of foreign influence. Let's talk fashion first, because if there's one thing the Tang Dynasty understood, it was that you could never have too much flair. Persian robes, Indian spices, and exotic dyes flooded the markets, creating a vibrant tapestry of styles. The Tang elite were like the Instagram influencers of their day. They set trends that others scrambled to emulate. And what epic trends they were. Picture men and women donning silk garments, the colors as vibrant as a sunset after a storm. And let's not forget the hairstyles, which were often so elaborate they required their own gravitational field. But it wasn't just about looking fabulous. The Silk Road was also a culinary melting pot. Want a taste of Persia? How about a dash of Central Asian flavor? The Tang Dynasty was all about fusion cuisine long before it became a culinary buzzword. Yet, not every imported dish was a hit. Some food choices were as questionable as that one friend who insists pineapple belongs on pizza. Fermented mare's milk, anyone. How about a bowl of sour fish soup? Let's just say that culinary bravery was a requirement for the Tang palate. Of course, the Silk Road wasn't just serving up fashion and food. It was dishing out a hearty serving of religion too. Buddhism rode into China on the backs of traders and monks, bringing with it new philosophies and practices. The Tang Dynasty became a melting pot of religious thought, embracing Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism with open arms. Picture Chang'an as a spiritual buffet, where one could sample a little bit of everything. This wasn't just cultural tourism. It was a genuine exchange of ideas that shaped the spiritual landscape of China for centuries. Now, it's time to address the legend and controversy surrounding Empress Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian, the empress who has been painted both as a ruthless tyrant and a proto-feminist icon. She was the only woman to officially rule as an emperor in Chinese history, and her rise to power was the stuff of legend, or a particularly dramatic episode of Game of Thrones. Wu Zetian wasn't just playing the game, she was rewriting the rules. Born in 624 AD, Wu entered the palace as a lowly concubine, but quickly rose through the ranks with a mix of political acumen, and let's be honest, a nose for opportunity that would make even the shrewdest politician blush. She was a master of court intrigue, often accused of eliminating rivals with the kind of efficiency that would make a modern corporate executive envious. But let's not jump to conclusions faster than you can say power-hungry. While her methods were often ruthless, Wu Zetian also championed arts, education, and civil service reforms. She opened up government positions to those with merit rather than birthright, a move that would have made her the toast of any progressive cocktail party. Yet, her reign wasn't all enlightenment and empowerment. Wu Zetian's rule was marked by a propaganda machine that would put modern spin doctors to shame. She commissioned biographies to embellish her achievements and statues to immortalize her image. But hey, if you can't control your narrative, are you even ruling? Some historians have painted her as a bloodthirsty villain, while others see her as a visionary leader shackled by the prejudices of her time. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the cracks between legend and reality. Wu Zetian was a woman who defied societal norms, and in doing so, she became both a role model and a cautionary tale. So, as we wrap up this leg of our journey through the Tang Dynasty, remember this. Beneath the glittering silks and poetic verses, the era was a complex web of cultural exchange, political machinations, and social upheavals. The Tang Dynasty wasn't just a period, it was an experience, a kaleidoscope of humanity at its most vibrant and volatile. And as we continue to unravel its stories, let's keep our eyes peeled for both the dazzling myths and the gritty truths that history has to offer. And speaking of experiences, let's take a stroll through the Tang Dynasty's architectural wonderland, where the buildings reached for the sky like overachieving students. The Tang Dynasty wasn't content with just leaving a cultural mark. They wanted their legacy to stand tall, literally. Picture this. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was a bustling metropolis that could give any modern city a run for its money. With a population of nearly 1 million people, it was the beating heart of the empire and a spectacular showcase of Tang architectural prowess. Chang'an was like a meticulously organized beehive, buzzing with activity and as orderly as a librarian's dream. The city was laid out in a grid pattern that would make Marie Kondo nod in approval. 9 main streets and 11 avenues crisscrossing a city that spanned over 30 square miles. This urban planning was no accident. It was a deliberate choice to reflect the harmony and order of the cosmos, because why not align your city with the universe while you're at it? But let's talk buildings, shall we? The Tang architects were like the rock stars of their day, crafting structures that defied the limits of wood and stone. Take the giant wild goose pagoda, for instance. This towering edifice, originally built in 652 AD, stood at an impressive height of 177 feet, making it the ancient equivalent of a skyscraper. And just like all good skyscrapers, it was more than just a pretty face. The pagoda was a crucial hub for Buddhist texts, brought from India by the monk Xuanzang, who clearly had an eye for both spiritual enlightenment and architectural grandeur. Now, if you're imagining these pagodas as serene sanctuaries of peace, think again. They were as much a part of the city's social fabric as the local tea house. People would gather around these structures not just to pray, but to discuss philosophy, politics, and perhaps the latest court gossip. These buildings were the Tang Dynasty's answer to combining a cathedral, a library, and a town square all in one. And it wasn't just about the towering pagodas. The Tang Dynasty was a time when Buddhist temples and Confucian schools sprouted up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. These institutions were as ubiquitous as coffee shops in a hipster neighborhood, each one competing for the title of Spiritual Enlightenment HQ. But let's not romanticize this too much. The explosion of religious and educational buildings was as much about power and influence as it was about piety. Monasteries became wealthy landowners, wielding economic power that would make even the most ambitious venture capitalists blush. Now, let's pivot to the scholars, those scholarly types who were the intellectual elite of the Tang Dynasty. Ah, the scholar officials, those idealized paragons of wisdom and virtue, who supposedly spent their days composing poetry and engaging in high-minded debates. But hold on to your quills, because the reality was a bit more cutthroat. The civil service exams, the very gateway to this illustrious world, were as brutal as they come. Imagine a test so grueling that only about 1-2% of candidates passed. That's right, the Tang civil service exam was basically the Hunger Games, but with ink and paper instead of bows and arrows. These exams were designed to select the brightest minds to serve the empire, and they tested everything from Confucian classics to the ability to compose poetry on the fly. But let's not kid ourselves. This was as much a test of endurance as it was of intellect. Candidates would spend years preparing, often starting as young as 4 or 5. The exams themselves were multi-day marathons held in cramped cells where candidates had to bring their own food, bedding, and even chamber parts. Talk about a test of character. And yet, despite the harsh realities, the allure of becoming a scholar official was undeniable. Success meant prestige, power, and a chance to influence the empire's future. It was the ultimate meritocracy, or at least that's the narrative. In truth, the system was rife with corruption and nepotism, where wealth and connections often mattered as much as raw talent. But hey, who needs a level playing field when you can have a level of intrigue that would make Machiavelli proud? So, what does all this tell us about the Tang Dynasty? For one, it was a time of dizzying ambition, where the sky was quite literally the limit. From the meticulously planned streets of Chang'an to the towering pagodas that dotted the landscape, the Tang were always reaching higher. But beneath the soaring heights and grand structures lay a society of stark contrasts, where the promise of enlightenment was tempered by the reality of human imperfection. The Tang Dynasty was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, creativity, and a fair bit of cunning. It was an era where architecture wasn't just about buildings. It was about making a statement. It was a time when the pursuit of knowledge was both a noble endeavor and a ruthless competition. And as we continue our journey through this remarkable period, remember that the Tang Dynasty was more than just a golden age. It was a complex web of dreams and realities, aspirations and struggles, all intertwined in the grand tapestry of history. And speaking of those shimmering threads, let's weave our way into the social fabric of Tang Dynasty society, where your family name was your calling card, and social mobility was about as easy as becoming a viral sensation without internet access. This was a time when your ancestral pedigree did more for your career than a fancy CV ever could. Think of it as the dynastic version of LinkedIn, where connections and heritage spoke louder than the most eloquent poem. The Tang Dynasty was an era where society was neatly divided into classes like a well-organized closet. At the top, you had the aristocracy, those privileged few who could trace their lineage back to the Han Dynasty or earlier. These were the folks who could afford to throw lavish banquets that made Gatsby's parties look like backyard barbecues. Their influence was immense, often dictating the political and cultural currents of the time. It was like they had the ultimate backstage pass to the empire, with the emperor himself often relying on their support. Then came the scholar officials, a class of intellectual elites who had clawed their way up the social ladder through the grueling civil service exams we discussed earlier. They were the bureaucrats, the policy makers, and the poets, though let's be honest, it was the poetry that really got the crowd going. These scholar officials were the real-life influencers of the Tang Dynasty, shaping the narrative and culture with every brush stroke. Below them were the commoners, the hard-working backbone of Tang society. These were the farmers, artisans, and merchants who toiled day in and day out to keep the empire's engine running. It's easy to romanticize their simplicity, but the reality was far less glamorous. For many, life was a relentless grind, with little hope of upward mobility. It was a world where hard work didn't always translate into a better life, a sentiment that echoes through the ages. But let's not forget the women of the Tang Dynasty, who were more than just silent figures in the background. They navigated a patriarchal world with a level of finesse that would make even the most seasoned diplomat nod in appreciation. While the society was largely male-dominated, women wielded their own kind of power, often behind the scenes. Take, for example, the role of mothers in arranging marriages, alliances that were as crucial as political treaties. A well-negotiated marriage could elevate a family's status faster than you can say dowry. Women of the Tang were also influential in the arts, with many becoming celebrated poets and musicians. The poetess Yu Xuanji, for instance, was a remarkable figure who defied convention by living a life that was both scandalous and inspirational. Her poetry was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the struggles and desires of women in a world that often sought to silence them. These women were more than just muses. They were creators, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in their time. But let's not romanticize it too much. Women still faced significant constraints. They were often subject to the whims of their male relatives and had limited legal rights. However, the Tang Dynasty did offer some avenues for greater freedom, especially when compared to other periods in Chinese history. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and in some cases, even pursue careers in trade or the arts. It was a society in flux, where the old and new collided in fascinating ways. Now, let's switch gears and talk about technology, because the Tang Dynasty was all about innovation, even if they didn't have smartphones. Enter the woodblock printing press, the ancient world's version of going viral. This was Printing Press 1.0, an invention that revolutionized communication and education. The Tang craftsmen took the concept of woodblock printing and ran with it, churning out texts faster than a medieval scribe could say, manuscript. This technological marvel wasn't just about mass-producing Buddhist scriptures or Confucian texts. It was about democratizing knowledge. Suddenly, ideas could spread far and wide, crossing geographical and social boundaries. It was the precursor to the information age, minus the Wi-Fi. The availability of printed texts meant that education was no longer the sole privilege of the elite. More people than ever could access literature, philosophy, and scientific knowledge. And what did this mean for the Tang society as a whole? It was a game changer, shifting the balance of power ever so slightly. Those who could read and write had access to a world of ideas, challenging the status quo and pushing the boundaries of traditional thought. It was as if the empire had unlocked a treasure trove of intellectual wealth, and everyone wanted a piece of it. But let's not kid ourselves. This newfound access was still limited by class and wealth. The majority of the population remained illiterate, with education often confined to the sons of the wealthy. Yet, the seeds of change were sown, and the impact of this technological leap would echo through the centuries. So, as we continue to explore the Tang Dynasty, remember that it was a world of stark contrasts, where social hierarchies were as rigid as they were intricate. It was an era of innovation and tradition, where the old guard clashed with the new wave of thinkers and creators. The Tang Dynasty was a kaleidoscope of human experience, with each turn revealing new patterns and possibilities. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into this remarkable period, peeling back the layers of history to uncover the stories that shaped an empire. From the bustling streets of Chang'an to the quiet corners of scholarly retreats, the Tang Dynasty offers a rich tapestry of life, love, ambition, and dreams. The adventure is just beginning, and the stories are waiting to be told. So, as we wrap up our whirlwind tour of the Tang Dynasty, a place where poetry was practically a form of currency and social mobility was as rare as a unicorn sighting, we find ourselves at the point where the empire's illustrious narrative begins to unravel. If you've ever watched a season finale where all the plot lines collide in a glorious, chaotic crescendo, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The Tang Dynasty, for all its cultural and economic swagger, couldn't escape the gravitational pull of its own internal contradictions. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of how things started to go south. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a single dramatic event, but a series of unfortunate choices that would make even Lemony Snicket nod in approval. First off, financial mismanagement. The Tang officials seem to have taken a page, or perhaps an entire book, from the guide to how not to run an empire. While the Silk Road was the gift that kept on giving, funneling wealth and ideas into China like an ancient version of PayPal, it wasn't immune to the economic pressures of overspending and corruption. The equal field system, which had been their ace in the hole for agricultural productivity, began to crumble as aristocratic families gobbled up land like it was the last slice of pizza at a party. And then there was the Enlushan Rebellion. Enlushan, the general who thought, why just serve an empire when you can try to start your own? In 755 AD, Enlushan led a revolt that shook the very foundations of the Tang Dynasty. For nearly 8 years, his rebellion wreaked havoc, causing untold chaos and draining the empire's coffers faster than you can say, rebel with a cause. It was a financial black hole, and by the time the dust settled, the Tang Dynasty was left reeling from the loss of millions of lives and a severely weakened grip on its territories. But wait, there's more. As if internal strife wasn't enough, external pressures were knocking at the Tang Dynasty's door like an unwelcome guest at a dinner party. Neighboring powers, ever the opportunists, saw the Tang's vulnerability as a golden ticket to expand their influence. The Tibetan Empire and the Uyghurs, among others, pressed their territorial advantages, taking bites out of the once mighty Tang like a pack of wolves at a buffet. The empire's borders, which had once stretched like an overconfident yoga student, began to contract, leaving the Tang grappling with the harsh reality of diminished power. Meanwhile, back at the capital, the political scene was a hotbed of intrigue and backstabbing that would make a reality TV producer drool. The once stable civil service, the bedrock of Tang governance, was riddled with factionalism and corruption. Officials were more concerned with personal gain than the empire's well-being, turning the court into a veritable soap opera of deceit and betrayal. It was a time when loyalty was fleeting, and alliances shifted like desert sands, leading to a series of weak emperors whose reigns were more like brief interludes than lasting legacies. So, what does this all mean in the grand tapestry of history? Well, the decline of the Tang Dynasty is a potent reminder that even the brightest stars can burn out. It's a tale as old as time. A combination of overreach, internal decay, and external pressure can topple even the mightiest of empires. But let's not get too cynical here. The Tang Dynasty, for all its eventual downfall, left an indelible mark on history. Its cultural and technological contributions, from poetry to printing, shaped the world in ways that still resonate today. In the end, The Tang Dynasty is both a cautionary tale and an enduring inspiration. It's a story of ambition and excess, of brilliance and blindness. It's a testament to the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly. So, as you tuck this tale into the folds of your memory, remember that history is never just black and white. It's a kaleidoscope of colors, each turn revealing new patterns and possibilities. And as we bid farewell to the Tang Dynasty, let's carry its lessons with us. A reminder that while empires may rise and fall, the stories they leave behind are forever. Even before the sun fully stretches over the Roman skyline, you're already up, ready to tackle another day in the Eternal City. Your first stop, the kitchen, or for most Romans, the closest thing to it. Now, don't be fooled by Hollywood's penchant for portraying ancient Rome as a non-stop banquet of grapes and decadence. In reality, breakfast was as humble as it gets. Breakfast, or *intaculum* if you're feeling fancy, is a simple affair. The staple item, bread. But this isn't your artisanal sourdough from the trendy bakery down the street. It's more like a dense, chewy loaf made from *faro*, an ancient grain that kept the Roman Empire running. Forget about toast with avocado. You're dipping this bread in a cup of wine. Yes, wine. It turns out the Romans were onto the breakfast of champions concept long before Kellogg's. Here's the kicker. The quality of your breakfast table directly correlates with your social status. If you're a plebeian, which is to say, not rolling in denarii, your bread is probably made from coarser grains. Maybe you sprinkle a little salt on top if you're feeling extravagant. But if you're an elite Roman, perhaps a senator, your bread could be made from the finest flour, accompanied by some cheese or olives. Eggs, honey, and even some fruit might find their way onto your breakfast spread if you're really living the good life. But let's not romanticize this too much. That bread dipping in wine. It's not because the Romans were early-day sommeliers. It's mostly to soften the bread up a bit. Remember, this is ancient bread we're talking about, and it could rival modern-day bricks in both density and durability. Why such a lean start to the day, you ask? Well, most of Rome's citizens were hustling to make a living. They needed something quick and easy. Farming, after all, was the backbone of the Roman economy, and it wasn't just for the country folk. Even city dwellers had a stake in agriculture. Grains like wheat and barley were the empire's bread and butter, quite literally. They were grown in vast quantities and fed not just Rome, but cities all over the empire. The state controlled much of the grain supply, doling out monthly rations to citizens in a bid for peace and stability. Think of it as an ancient precursor to social security. And while the idea of a leisurely breakfast sounds delightful, most Romans didn't have that luxury. With the city bustling to life at dawn, you'd likely be out the door, bread in hand, ready to face the day. The city was your dining room, and you weren't alone. Street vendors lined the roads, selling all manner of food to those on the go. That said, don't expect a lot of variety. While our modern breakfast extravaganzas might have you choosing between eggs Benedict and pancakes, ancient Romans had no such dilemma. Bread, wine, maybe some cheese, rinse and repeat. Let's not forget the slaves, the backbone of Roman households. For them, breakfast was whatever scraps they could muster, often after serving their masters. While the elites might indulge in a more varied breakfast, their slaves would be lucky to enjoy the crusts of bread. It's a harsh reminder that for all its glory and grandeur, Rome was a society deeply divided by class and status. So there you have it. Breakfast in ancient Rome wasn't a lavish affair filled with opulence and excess. It was a straightforward, no-nonsense start to the day, dictated more by necessity and practicality than by choice. Yet, even in its simplicity, it tells a story of an empire that was as diverse as it was complex, where the daily bread was as much a symbol of sustenance as it was a reminder of one's place in the social order. And as you step out into the streets of ancient Rome, leaving behind the remnants of your modest breakfast, you find yourself swept up in the hustle and bustle of the city waking up. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread mingling with the less than pleasant aromas of a metropolis still figuring out basic sanitation. Ah, the sweet perfume of history, your destination, the Roman market, or *forum*, the heartbeat of the city's economic life. But don't let the quaint image of a farmer's market fool you. This place is more Wall Street chaos than a Sunday stroll. It's noisy, crowded, and frankly, a bit overwhelming. Vendors shout over each other, hawking everything from fish to figs, while buyers haggle like their lives depend on it, which in many cases they do. Now, let's talk about the annona system, Rome's answer to the question, how do we keep the masses from revolting over bread prices? The annona was essentially the Roman welfare program, distributing grain to citizens at either subsidized rates or, if you were lucky, for free. It was a massive operation, akin to a modern-day government bailout, ensuring that Rome's population stayed fed and, more importantly, kept the peace. Notably, the grain itself wasn't homegrown. Much of it was imported from provinces like Egypt and North Africa, places that were the ancient world's breadbaskets. Here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just an act of altruism by the Roman state. No, this was politics, pure and simple. By the late Republic and into the Empire, the ever-growing city of Rome was bursting at the seams with people, many of whom were unemployed or underemployed. The grain dole wasn't just food. It was a tool for social stability, a way to placate the masses and prevent civil unrest. The annona system was the Roman emperor's insurance policy, a way to keep the plebs from grabbing their pitchforks and marching on the Senate. So, how did this all work exactly? Each month, citizens would queue up for their grain allotment, a process that could be as tedious as a DMV visit on a Monday morning. But for many Romans, this was a lifeline. The grain dole, known as Curie *, was available to about 200,000 citizens at its peak, a staggering number that speaks to the sheer scale of the operation. You could think of it as an ancient form of universal basic income, except instead of cash, you got wheat. But let's not sugarcoat it. The system wasn't perfect. Corruption was rife, as you might expect in any massive bureaucracy. Grain could be diverted or diluted, and the quality was often questionable. And while the annona kept many Romans from starvation, it wasn't exactly a path to prosperity. It was subsistence living, plain and simple. Turning away from the annona for a moment, let's consider the market's role in daily life. For many Romans, heading to the forum wasn't just about shopping. It was about survival. This was a society where missing a day at the market because of illness or bad weather could mean going without food. There were no refrigerators, after all, no stockpiling for a rainy day. Each trip was a gamble, a careful balancing act between haggling for the best price and ensuring your family had enough to eat. And let's not forget the social aspect. The market was Rome's social network, long before Zuckerberg came along. Gossip spread faster than the plague, and deals were made as much on reputation and relationships as on denarii. It was the ancient equivalent of networking, where knowing the right merchant could mean the difference between dining on fresh fish or yesterday's leftovers. In this bustling, chaotic environment, choice was a luxury few could afford. For most, it was about getting the best deal on whatever was available. The elites might enjoy a wider range of options, with imported delicacies and fine wines, but for the average Roman, variety was dictated by what was in season, what was affordable, and what was left after the wealthy had picked over the best. As you wander through the forum, it's hard not to marvel at the sheer complexity of this ancient economy. From the grain imports feeding the annona to the bustling market stalls, Rome was a city built on trade and commerce, an empire sustained by its ability to feed its people. Yet beneath the surface of this economic powerhouse lies a society deeply divided. The market, like the city itself, was a microcosm of Roman life, where the fortunes of the few were built on the labor and struggle of the many. It's a sobering reminder that while Rome may have been the center of the ancient world, it was also a place where survival was an everyday battle. And so, as the sun climbs higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the ancient stones, you find yourself caught in the ebb and flow of this eternal city. The market is alive with the sounds of haggling and the smells of fresh produce, a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of a people who, despite the odds, managed to build one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. But don't get too comfortable. There's still plenty more to uncover in this journey through ancient Rome's culinary landscape. Stay tuned, because next up, we'll dive even deeper into the kitchens and dining rooms of the past, exploring the meals that fueled an empire. As the market's chaos fades into the distance, you find yourself at the cusp of Rome's midday ritual, the ****. This wasn't just a meal. It was the culinary crescendo of the Roman day, a time when food and social maneuvering took center stage. While breakfast was a quick pit stop, Sina was a slow, deliberate spectacle, especially if you were one of the lucky few who could afford to dawdle over dishes. Let's start with the basics. What was on the table? Well, for the majority, the menu wasn't exactly Michelin star material. If you were a plebeian, you'd likely feast on a Mardist spread, if you can call it that, of pulse a porridge-like concoction made from emmer wheat or barley. Think of it as the Roman answer to oatmeal, minus the maple syrup and Instagrammable toppings. If you were doing well, maybe you'd throw in some lentils or chickpeas. It's humble fare, but it kept the masses going. Now, for the elites, dining was an entirely different affair. The wealthy Romans didn't just eat to survive, they dined to impress. Picture this, a lavish feast with peacocks, flamingos, and exotic spices that had traveled further than most Romans ever would. The more outrageous the dish, the better. It's like a culinary arms race, where the weapon of choice was your menu. Speaking of exotic imports, let's talk about some key players at the elite dinner table. The Romans had a taste for the exotic, and they'd spare no expense to get their hands on delicacies. Black pepper from India, garum from Spain, Rome was a gastronomic crossroads, and the affluent could afford to indulge. But don't let the romanticism of a sumptuous Roman feast fool you. This was a privilege reserved for the upper echelons. For the everyday Roman, these exotic ingredients were as distant as the lands they hailed from. Here's where it gets juicy. Dining wasn't just about the food. It was a form of social currency. A dinner invite from a senator wasn't just an opportunity to taste the latest culinary marvel. It was a chance to climb the social ladder. These meals were the ancient forerunners of today's power lunches, with alliances forged over wine-soaked conversations. It was the kind of networking LinkedIn would kill for. Now, while the thought of reclining on a couch, surrounded by friends and fine food, might sound idyllic, let's not sugarcoat the setting. The triclinia or dining rooms, of the wealthy were often opulent, with elaborate mosaics and silk-covered couches. But for the average Roman, dining was a more cramped affair. Imagine squeezing your family into a small room, jostling for space alongside your daily meal. And let's not forget the wine, a staple of the Roman dining experience. The elites were connoisseurs, swilling wine from Falernian vineyards, while the plebeians made do with the cheaper, often watered-down stuff. Wine was the great social equalizer, yet also a marker of status. It flowed at every feast, but the quality was as diverse as the diners themselves. But here's a plot twist that would make even the most seasoned historian do a double take. The Sina wasn't just about indulgence. It was a strategic battleground. The Romans had a knack for turning even the most mundane of activities into political theater. A well-orchestrated dinner could sway opinions, win support, or cement alliances. It's as if the Roman elites mastered the art of diplomacy one grape at a time. Yet, beneath the veneer of these grand meals lay stark social divides. For every sumptuous feast, there were countless Romans who knew hunger too well. While the elite swapped stories over stuffed dormice, the plebeians were often left to scrape by on whatever they could scrounge. It's the kind of dichotomy that reminds us Rome was as much a city of disparity as it was of grandeur. So next time someone waxes lyrical about the decadence of Roman feasts, remember that the reality was a bit more down to earth. The Roman dining experience was a complex brew of luxury and necessity, a microcosm of an empire where food was both sustenance and status symbol, a daily reminder of one's place in the social hierarchy. As you ponder this culinary tapestry, it's clear that food was more than just a means to an end. It was a reflection of the societal structures and economic forces that shaped the ancient world. Dining in Rome was a delicate dance of opulence and austerity, a reminder that the table was as much a battlefield as the forum or the senate. And while the Sina might have been the main event, the culinary journey doesn't end here. There's still more to uncover about Rome's gastronomic landscape, from the subtle intricacies of their cooking techniques to the ever-evolving tastes of a city that never stops eating or scheming. Stick around, because the next course promises to be every bit as fascinating as the last. And as the aroma of Rome's grand Sina begins to fade, you find yourself drawn towards the less glamorous, but equally fascinating, world of the Roman kitchen, or more accurately, the lack thereof. You see, the average Roman wasn't whipping up gourmet meals in some Tuscan-inspired kitchen. Oh no, For many, the idea of a personal kitchen was about as mythical as Romulus and Remus being raised by a she-wolf. Instead, the city was a mosaic of street vendors and communal cooking spaces, a culinary patchwork stitched together by necessity and practicality. Let's dive into the heart of this communal culinary endeavor. First off, why were private kitchens as rare as a senator without an agenda? The answer lies in the very bricks and mortar of Roman life. Most Romans lived in insulae or apartment blocks, which were more cramped than a modern studio in Manhattan. These multi-storied buildings were notorious for being fire hazards, and installing a kitchen in such a tinderbox was tantamount to inviting disaster. No wonder the Roman poet Juvenal once quipped about the constant fear of one's building going up in flames faster than a toga at a frat party. Enter the asterisk thermopolia asterisk, the ancient world's answer to the fast food joint. These were the bustling street-side eateries, where Romans of modest means grabbed a quick bite. Picture a cross between your neighborhood deli and a late-night kebab stand. Their prevalence speaks volumes about the Roman lifestyle. Busy, urban, and always on the go. Economics played a crucial role here. For many, the cost of maintaining a private kitchen was simply out of reach. It was cheaper and more convenient to grab a meal on the fly, much like us modern folks with our love for drive-thrus and takeout apps. Now, let's talk about the menu. The offerings at a asterisk thermopolium asterisk were straightforward. Think stews, soups, and porridge. If you were lucky, you might snag a piece of roasted meat or fish. But don't expect Michelin stars. This was about filling bellies, not indulging taste buds. In fact, archaeological digs have unearthed terracotta jars, or asterisk dolia asterisk, still bearing remnants of the original Roman fast food, lentils, chickpeas, and the ever-mysterious garum, a fermented fish sauce that was the ketchup of the ancient world. Yum! And what about those communal kitchens, known as asterisk papani asterisk? These were the Roman equivalent of a shared kitchen space. Think of them as the original co-working spaces, but instead of entrepreneurs and laptops, you had cooks and cauldrons. These kitchens were found in larger apartment complexes and served as the culinary hub for residents. The beauty of the asterisk papana asterisk was its democratizing effect. Here, social classes mingled over the sizzling pots, sharing recipes and stories. The tools of the trade were as utilitarian as they get. Forget about copper-bottomed pans and non-stick skillets. Roman cooks wielded simple clay pots and iron tripods. Their stoves, called asterisk foculi asterisk, were rudimentary affairs, essentially portable fire pits. Yet, despite these primitive tools, Roman cooks managed to create dishes that have tantalized historians and foodies alike. It's a testament to human ingenuity that they could do so much with so little. But don't let the simplicity of these tools fool you into thinking Roman cooking was bland or boring. Far from it. Romans loved their spices and sauces, adding complexity to even the humblest of dishes. Black pepper, cumin, and coriander were staples, while garum added a savory punch that modern palates might find. Let's say, challenging. And let's not forget olive oil, the liquid gold that flowed as freely as the Tiber, drenching everything from salads to stews. Why did street food and communal cooking flourish so robustly in Rome? The answer lies in the city's very fabric. Rome was a bustling metropolis, a melting pot of cultures and cuisines. The constant influx of people, traders, soldiers, and slaves, created a demand for quick, accessible food that met diverse tastes. The streets were alive with the clang of pots and the shouts of vendors, a cacophony that was as much a part of Roman life as the Colosseum or the Senate. And let's not romanticize this communal dining scene too much. It was a necessity born from economic constraints and social realities. For many, the choice wasn't between a home-cooked meal and street food. It was street food or nothing. This was a harsh reality of Roman life, a city where survival often meant grabbing what you could when you could. Yet, amid this hustle, there's a fascinating paradox. While the lack of private kitchens speaks to economic hardship, it also reflects a vibrant social network. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a communal experience, a way to share life and stories. The asterisk thermopolia asterisk and asterisk papani asterisk were the original social media platforms, where news was shared, alliances forged, and community built over bowls of steaming asterisk pulse asterisk. So next time you grab a bite from a food truck or share a meal at a communal table, Tip your hat to the Romans. They were the original purveyors of street food, pioneers of a trend that continues to feed the world in every sense. And as the afternoon shadows lengthen, casting a warm glow over the ancient stones, remember that the story of Roman food is far from over. We're just getting started, with more culinary secrets waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us as we continue to explore the kitchens and dining habits that fueled one of history's greatest empires. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting Rome in a golden glow, the city's heartbeat slows, but the culinary show is far from over. Evening in ancient Rome was a time when the social fabric of this sprawling metropolis was woven tightly around the dining table. The nighttime meal, *Vespena*, was a time for Romans to reflect on the day's hustle, but for the elites, it was often a prelude to the real event, a banquet that was as much about politics as it was about pleasure. Let's dig into the cultural significance of these banquets. Picture the scene: a Roman villa, opulent and sprawling, where the who's who of society recline on couches in the *triclinia*. This isn't just any dining room, it's a stage for political theatre. Banquets were the original power lunches, where alliances were forged and broken over dishes that could make a modern foodie weep with envy. It's here we see how Roman cuisine was not just about sustenance, but a tool of influence. It was a culinary chess game where the stakes were as high as the Senate's columns. Here's where the numbers come into play. A lavish banquet could host anywhere from a dozen to over 100 guests, with courses numbering up to 7 or more. We're talking about the kind of extravagance that would make even Gatsby blush. But let's not get carried away with visions of endless bounty. For the average Roman, this was a world as distant as the stars. While the elite dined on exotic imports like ostrich and flamingo, the plebeians were lucky to catch a whiff of the sumptuous aromas wafting through the city. The role of banquets in political life cannot be overstated. These gatherings were where emperors and senators alike showcased their wealth and power. A successful host was one who could procure the rarest ingredients and provide entertainment that kept tongues wagging long after the last course was served. This wasn't just about showing off. It was about securing loyalty and support. In the cutthroat world of Roman politics, a well-timed invitation to dinner could be as effective as a military campaign. Now, let's talk about the social rituals around dining. The Romans were nothing if not structured in their approach. Guests were seated according to status, with the most honored positions closest to the host. This wasn't just about politeness. It was a visual hierarchy, a reminder of one's place in the pecking order. The meal was a carefully orchestrated affair, with each course served in a specific order and each dish a testament to the host's culinary and cultural acumen. But here's the twist. While the elites were busy jockeying for position over peacock pie, the rest of Rome was engaging in their own version of social dining. Communal meals, often held in public spaces or shared kitchens, were a way for neighbors to connect, share stories, and support each other in the harsh realities of urban life. For many, these gatherings were a lifeline, a way to foster community in a city where survival was a daily challenge. And what of the enduring legacy of Roman cuisine? It's tempting to romanticize the opulence, but the real legacy lies in the way Romans democratized dining. They were pioneers of street food, the precursors to our modern culinary culture, where food is both sustenance and social lubricant. The Roman love of spices, sauces, and diverse ingredients laid the groundwork for a Mediterranean cuisine that continues to influence palates across the globe. Let's debunk a few persistent myths while we're here. The idea that all Romans indulged in lavish feasts is as misleading as a toga party in a college movie. The truth is, most Romans ate simply, with bread, olives, and the occasional bit of meat forming the backbone of their diet. The grand feasts were the exception, not the rule, a reality that speaks to the social and economic divides of the time. In the end, the story of Roman food practices is a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. From the bustling Thermopolia to the grand banquets of the elite, food was a central thread that connected Romans across time and class. It was a means of survival, a tool of power, and a reflection of the very fabric of Roman society. As the last embers of the day's fires die out, leaving Rome to the quiet of the night, we're left with a culinary legacy that extends far beyond the city's ancient walls. a legacy that continues to flavor our world in ways both subtle and profound. So there you have it, the vibrant tapestry of Roman cuisine, woven with threads of politics, culture, and survival. It's a story that reminds us that while empires may rise and fall, the human love affair with food endures. Whether you're dining on street food or hosting a grand feast, remember that you're part of a tradition as old as Rome itself. And as the city settles into slumber, know that its culinary spirit will awaken again with the dawn, ready to feed the hungry masses of history, one dish at a time. Back in the bustling streets of Rome around 163 BCE, the city was a perfect cocktail of ambition, politics, and a bit of chaos, kind of like a reality show, but with more tunics and fewer confessional interviews. Enter Tiberius Gracchus, a kid born straight into the Roman political hall of fame. Why? His dad, Tiberius Gracchus the Elder, was basically the Roman equivalent of a superstar general and a political bigwig. We're talking about a guy who, as consul, celebrated two triumphs, those grand victory parades that were the Roman version of the Oscars. Tiberius, the Elder, was also the guy you'd want on your team during a crisis, like when he negotiated peace with the Celtiberians of Spain. Not a peace treaty you'd want to sign off on with a shaky hand. But let's not forget Mom, Cornelia Africana. Forget celebrity influencers. She was the ancient Roman paragon of virtue, daughter of Scipio Africanus, the guy who kicked Hannibal's butt at Zama in 202 BCE. So yeah, no pressure, Tiberius Jr. With parents like these, his family dinners must have been like a TED talk, except with more garum sauce and fewer PowerPoint slides. Now, here's the thing about growing up Gracchus. You weren't just anybody. You were in the thick of the political whirlpool of the Roman Republic. And what a glorious mess it was. Rome was expanding faster than a teenager's shoe size, garbling up territories and bringing back wealth by the shipload. But with great power comes great economic disparity. Spoiler alert. This is where Tiberius's wild ideas about wealth distribution start brewing. But hold up, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Young Tiberius was first a student, learning the ropes of oratory and philosophy, probably from the best Greek tutors money could buy. The dude was primed to be a mover and shaker, and the political climate was like a tinderbox ready to ignite. The Senate was packed with patricians who thought they were the bee's knees. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few, while the average Roman farmer was getting squeezed like a lemon at a lemonade stand. Cornelia, for her part, was a widow by the time Tiberius was still growing into his toga. But she didn't remarry, opting instead to raise her kids with an iron will and a penchant for moral lessons. She was so revered that statues were later erected in her honor, and Roman matrons were told to be like Cornelia. In a society that valued pedigree, she wielded her name like a sword and shield. Now, let's break down the economic scene a bit more. Rome was riding high on its imperial conquests, but most of the booty was being hogged by the top 1%. Sound familiar? The rich were getting richer, buying up land like it was going out of style, and the poor were just getting, well, poorer. The plebeians, Rome's common folk, were feeling the squeeze as small farms went under, unable to compete with the sprawling estates worked by slaves. Tiberius was soaking all this in. He didn't just see the glitter of Roman expansion. He saw the cracks forming underneath. The myth of Rome as a land of opportunity was just that, a myth. Sure, it was a great time to be alive if you were a senator or a wealthy landowner, but for everyone else, not so much. And while the romanticized version of Rome paints a picture of a unified republic, the reality was that of a society teetering on the edge of class warfare. Despite the glamour of his upbringing, Tiberius wasn't just another pampered aristocrat. He was a thinker, a reformer in the making, and he had the guts to challenge the status quo. But before any of that, he had to grow up in the shadow of his parents' legacies, learn the ropes of Roman politics, and get a feel for the lay of the land, both literally and figuratively. So, as young Tiberius watched the Roman Senate do its thing, a mix of power plays, backstabbing, and a bit of legislating, he was already dreaming of shaking things up. It's a testament to his upbringing that he saw beyond the pomp and ceremony, recognizing that the future of Rome depended on more than just conquest and celebration. It needed reform, and Tiberius Gracchus was just the guy to start stirring the pot. But all in due time, because first he had to navigate the labyrinth of Roman politics, And that, my friends, was just as treacherous as it sounds. So, picture young Tiberius, absorbing the political shenanigans like a sponge at a toga party, and then, bam, whisked off to the military front lines. Because if you're a Roman aristocrat worth your salt, you don't just sit around Rome sipping wine. You prove your mettle on the battlefield. Enter the Numantine War, where Tiberius Gracchus would find himself knee-deep in the muck of military chaos and logistics nightmares. Now, let's set the stage here. It's around 137 BCE, and Rome's idea of military organization was, shall we say, a bit rustic. Imagine trying to run an army with a supply chain that makes the worst DMV look efficient. Soldiers were expected to provide their own gear, and if you were a poor farmer, that meant your gear was probably held together by hopes and prayers. As for rations, let's just say you might find more nutrition in a modern-day fast food burger. Tiberius, however, wasn't just any grunt in the legions. Thanks to his illustrious lineage, he was appointed as quaestor, essentially the guy in charge of the purse strings. Part accountant, part quartermaster, he was responsible for managing the army's finances and supplies. This was no small feat, given that the Senate's idea of budgeting was tighter than a miser's coin purse. They expected miracles while offering little more than a pat on the back and a good luck out there. But the real kicker, the Numantine War, was a hot mess. The Roman army was tasked with subduing the Celtiberian city of Numantia, a tenacious holdout in what's now northern Spain. These Celtiberians were not about to roll over and play defeated. They were like the underdog team that kept pulling off surprise victories, leaving the Romans scratching their heads and adjusting their laurel wreaths. The conflict dragged on for years, with Roman forces facing not just fierce resistance, but logistical nightmares that would make an ancient Roman general weep into his wine. Enter Tiberius, who, despite the chaos, managed to negotiate a temporary peace with the Numantines. Perhaps it was his dad's diplomatic genes kicking in, or maybe he just had a knack for reading the room. Either way, he brokered a deal that allowed the Roman forces to retreat without further bloodshed. It was a military and political tightrope walk, but Tiberius pulled it off. Upon his return to Rome, Tiberius was hailed as a hero. You'd think this would be the moment where he could kick back and bask in the glory, right? Wrong. Because back in Rome, things were just as dysfunctional as ever. The Senate, that august body of toga-clad traditionalists, was too busy with their own agendas to deal with minor issues like economic disparity and land reforms. Because, hey, why fix what's broken when you can just ignore it? This is where Tiberius's experiences in the war come full circle. He'd seen firsthand how the underfunded, overworked Roman soldiers, many from small farming backgrounds, were getting the short end of the stick. These weren't just soldiers. They were citizens who would return to farms that were either neglected or swallowed up by the wealthy elite, thanks to Rome's insatiable hunger for land. The economic disparity Tiberius witnessed was a slap in the face, and it was festering back in Rome like a bad wound. The rich were living it up in their villas, while the plebeians were struggling to keep their heads above water. It was like a bad episode of Keeping Up with the Patricians, where the stakes were much higher than who wore it best. Tiberius's disillusionment with the Senate was palpable. They were supposed to be the guardians of Roman virtue and stability, yet they seemed more interested in who could outsmart whom in the Senate chamber. The land reform laws, designed to redistribute public land to the poor, were gathering dust, while the rich played monopoly with the countryside. And so, Tiberius Gracchus found himself at a crossroads. The Numantine War had been an eye-opener, a brutal masterclass in the economic and social disparities plaguing Rome. He realized that if Rome was to survive its own ambitions, something had to give. The question was, did he have the guts to stand up to the Senate and risk it all for the sake of reform? Stay tuned, folks, because Tiberius Gracchus was about to stir the pot in ways that would make the Roman Senate wish they'd paid more attention to those dusty reform laws. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's leave our hero contemplating his next move in a city that was more interested in maintaining the status quo than addressing the cracks in its foundation. And so, Tiberius Gracchus stood at the precipice of history, not with the quiet resignation of a man beaten down by bureaucracy, but with a rebellious glint in his eye. It was 133 BCE, and Tiberius, a man not exactly known for his patience, decided to shake things up by running for tribune of the plebs. Now, in Rome, The tribune wasn't just some decorative title you slapped on a business card. It was the voice of the common folk, the plebeians. Not exactly a gig for the faint of heart, especially when your platform involved poking the Senate's sacred cow, land reform. You see, Tiberius had a plan, and it was a doozy. The Lex Sempronia Agraria, as it would be known, was his bold attempt to wrestle land from the iron grip of the elite and give it back to the people. Picture Robin Hood in a toga, but instead of bows and arrows, he was armed with rhetoric and legislation. The bill aimed to enforce a long-ignored law that capped the amount of public land any individual could hold. In theory, this was a no-brainer. Rome's land laws were more outdated than a toga at a tech convention, and Tiberius was ready to give them a much-needed makeover. But here's where it gets sticky. The Roman Senate, that bastion of tradition and privilege, was less enthusiastic about this makeover. They were the patrician class. After all, men who believed land was their birthright, not some commoner's entitlement. Tiberius's proposal was about as welcome as a toga malfunction at a public festival. The Senate couldn't ignore him, though. His family name brought with it the kind of clout that made even the most jaded senator sit up and take notice. Yet, as anyone who's ever dealt with bureaucratic inertia knows, having a good idea isn't enough. You need strategy, allies, and occasionally a bit of cunning deceit. Enter the political machinations that made Game of Thrones look like a friendly game of chess. Tiberius had to navigate a Senate that was more interested in self-preservation than social justice. Vetoes were flying like confetti at a Roman triumph. Other tribunes, like Marcus Octavius, one of Tiberius's own, orchestrated opposition that was less about the public good and more about keeping the status quo intact. Imagine this. Tiberius is on the rostra, the public-speaking platform in the forum, passionately defending his bill while Octavius, with the tact of a seasoned politician, uses his veto power to block it. It was like a legislative ping-pong match, with real stakes on the line, namely, the livelihoods of countless Roman citizens. Tiberius, however, was not one to back down. In a controversial move, he sought to depose Octavius from his tribunate position, arguing that anyone who opposed the will of the people had no place representing them. It was a bold, unprecedented move that shook the foundations of Roman politics. The social and economic inequalities at play were staggering. Rome's expansion had created a wealth gap wider than the Tiber. The rich were amassing estates worked by armies of slaves, while the average Roman farmer was left with dirt under their nails and little else. The countryside was dotted with the remnants of once proud farms, now swallowed by sprawling latifundia, massive estates that were the patricians' ticket to endless profits. And who was left to serve in the military? Those same disenfranchised farmers who were too poor to afford the very land they defended with their lives. Tiberius's land reform was more than just a policy proposal. It was a lifeline for the Roman Republic's future. Without it, the social contract between Rome's citizens and their government was on the verge of collapse. The plebeians were restless, and Tiberius knew that their support was the key to his success. He wasn't just a reformer. He was a man on a mission, driven by a vision of Rome that was fairer, more equitable. But here's the kicker. In pushing for reform, Tiberius wasn't just challenging the Senate's authority. He was challenging the very nature of Roman politics. The idea that a tribune could bypass the Senate and appeal directly to the people was revolutionary. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power, one that threatened the oligarchic structure of Roman governance. In a society where tradition was as revered as the gods themselves, Tiberius's actions were nothing short of sacrilege. Yet he pressed on, driven by a belief that Rome could be better, that it could live up to its ideals. And while he was revered by the masses, he was feared by the elite, who saw in him a threat to their way of life. The tension in Rome was palpable. The Senate, unable to outright block Tiberius's bill, resorted to a smear campaign, painting him as a demagogue, a man who sought power for its own sake. But Tiberius was undeterred. He knew that reform was not just necessary, it was inevitable. The question was whether Rome would embrace it peacefully or be dragged into it kicking and screaming. And so, as Tiberius Gracchus stood in the forum, the weight of history on his shoulders, he was faced with a choice: to compromise and appease the Senate or to push forward, risking everything for the chance to change Rome for the better. It was a gamble, to be sure, but one worth taking for the sake of the Republic's future. Stay tuned, my friends, because the story of Tiberius Gracchus is far from over. The stakes are high, the tensions higher, and as we delve deeper into the political machinations of Rome, the question remains, can one man change the course of history, or will he be consumed by the very system he seeks to reform? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain. Tiberius Gracchus was not a man who went quietly into the night. As the dust settled in the Forum, Tiberius Gracchus found himself at a crossroads that looked more like a Roman intersection packed with chariots in rush hour. The stakes were sky high, and the pressure was mounting like a Roman bathhouse steam room. With his reform bill still hanging in the balance, Tiberius knew that he needed to play his cards right or risk being tossed aside by the Senate like yesterday's leftovers. Let's talk about those cards, shall we? Tiberius wasn't just some upstart with a dream. He was a shrewd political operator who knew how to work the crowd, a skill that would make any social media influencer green with envy. He understood that the key to pushing his reforms was to galvanize public support, which meant mastering the fine art of populist politics. And by Jupiter, did he have the moves? First off, Tiberius knew his audience better than a bard at a tavern. He tapped into the frustrations of the Roman plebeians, who were tired of watching their dreams of land ownership slip away faster than a greased pig at a festival. The rich were playing a zero-sum game with land, and Tiberius was ready to flip the board. By positioning himself as the champion of the people, he created a narrative that was as compelling as any epic tale. But he didn't stop there. Tiberius was a master of alliances, understanding that even the boldest tribune couldn't stand alone against the Senate's juggernaut. He reached out to influential figures like Appius Claudius Pulcher, his father-in-law, and Publius Licinius Crassus, the Pontifex Maximus, men whose support was like gold-plated armor in the political battlefield. These alliances were crucial, not just for their political clout, but for the strategic wisdom they brought to the table. It was a classic case of keep your friends close and your influential in-laws closer. Now, let's not pretend Tiberius's strategy was all sunshine and olive branches. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, using populist tactics that would make even the savviest campaign manager nod in approval. He organized public meetings, taking his message directly to the people in a move that bypassed the Senate and its stifling bureaucracy. This was Roman direct democracy in action, with the Forum serving as the ancient equivalent of a town hall meeting, minus the PowerPoint slides and free coffee. As Tiberius rallied the masses, the Senate watched with increasing unease, their power slipping through their fingers like sand in an hourglass. In an ironic twist, the Senate's attempts to undermine Tiberius only fueled his popularity. The more they painted him as a demagogue, the more the public saw him as a champion. It was political judo at its finest, using the Senate's weight against them in a deft maneuver that left them floundering. But here's where the plot thickens. With the Senate obstructing his every move, Tiberius did the unthinkable. He bypassed them entirely. In a bold, and let's be honest, controversial, move, he took his bill directly to the plebeian assembly. This was a seismic shift in Roman politics, akin to a gladiator walking into an arena armed with a fully loaded ballista. It was a gamble, to be sure, but one that paid off as the assembly passed his land reform bill with overwhelming support. Yet, as anyone who's ever played the political game knows, victory is rarely final, and the road ahead was fraught with obstacles. Tiberius's reforms were now law, but enforcing them was another matter entirely. The Senate, licking their wounds, refused to allocate the necessary funds to implement the legislation. A classic case of we'll pass it, but good luck enforcing it. Undeterred, Tiberius turned to the kingdom of Pergamon for a financial lifeline. King Attalus Roman III had recently died, bequeathing his kingdom to Rome, a windfall that Tiberius saw as the perfect opportunity to fund his reforms. He proposed using the Pergamene treasury to bankroll the redistribution of land, a move that was as audacious as it was ingenious. It was a masterstroke, leveraging international politics to solve domestic woes, and it left the Senate scrambling for a response. Yet, even as he navigated these treacherous waters, Tiberius knew that the political landscape was shifting beneath his feet. With his term as tribune coming to an end, he made the fateful decision to run for re-election, a move that was as unprecedented as it was contentious. In Rome, The idea of serving consecutive terms as tribune was about as popular as suggesting Julius Caesar take up knitting. This re-election campaign set the stage for high drama, the kind that would make a Greek tragedy look like a light comedy. Tiberius's opponents accused him of seeking a dictatorship, while his supporters saw him as the only hope for meaningful reform. The public spectacle was both absurd and compelling, with Tiberius playing the role of the embattled hero fighting against the odds. In the midst of this political maelstrom, Tiberius deployed his most powerful weapon, his public persona. He had a knack for turning adversity into opportunity, using humor and irony to diffuse tensions and rally his base. His speeches were laced with wit and biting sarcasm, skewering the Senate's hypocrisy while reaffirming his commitment to the people. It was a performance worthy of the stage, and it captivated a city on the brink of change. Yet, as election day loomed, the atmosphere in Rome was electric with anticipation. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and the stakes were higher than ever. The question on everyone's lips was simple. Would Tiberius Gracchus, the man who dared defy the Senate, secure a second term and cement his legacy as the great reformer of Rome? Or would he be brought down by the very forces he sought to reform? Stay tuned, because the story of Tiberius Gracchus is racing toward a climax that promises to be as unpredictable as it is riveting. With his re-election hanging in the balance, the fate of Rome, and one man's vision for its future, hangs by a thread. Whatever the outcome, Tiberius's legacy is assured. A trailblazer who dared to dream of a Rome more just, more equitable, and ultimately more resilient in the face of change. The next chapter will reveal whether that dream becomes reality or remains one of history's great what-ifs. And so, the morning of election day dawned over Rome, a city teetering on the edge of chaos. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a gladius. Tiberius Gracchus, the reformer who had dared to thumb his nose at the Senate and dream of a better Rome, was about to face his reckoning. The forum was abuzz, packed tighter than a Roman banquet with citizens eager to cast their votes or just witness the spectacle. This wasn't just any election. It was a referendum on the future of the Republic itself. Now, you think that an election might be a civilized affair, but this was Rome, where political intrigue was practically an Olympic event. Tiberius, with his sharp tongue and sharper ideas, had made plenty of enemies, and they weren't about to let him walk back into power unopposed. Senate, that august body of patricians who preferred their change slow and their wine fast, was plodding in the shadows. Rumors swirled of bribes, threats, and all the usual political skullduggery. Meanwhile, Tiberius was working the crowd, his charisma and conviction as palpable as the summer heat. As the votes were being cast, the atmosphere in the forum was electric, crackling with anticipation and dread. But what should have been a day of democratic triumph quickly descended into chaos. You see, Tiberius's opponents weren't content to let the ballots decide his fate. They had a more permanent solution in mind, one that involved less counting and more clobbering. The tension snapped when a brawl broke out, the kind of free-for-all that would make a gladiator match look like a friendly game of dice. Amidst the chaos, Tiberius found himself caught in a storm of rage and violence. His enemies, led by Scipio Nasica, the Pontifex Maximus himself, saw their chance to rid themselves of this troublesome reformer once and for all. Armed with nothing more than table legs and a righteous fury, they descended upon Tiberius and his supporters with brutal efficiency. It was less a political assassination and more a public lynching, a savage display of the Senate's desperation to maintain control. In the end, Tiberius Gracchus, the man who dared to challenge the status quo, lay dead on the stones of the forum, his dreams of reform dashed amidst the bloody chaos. It was a grim reminder that in Rome, power was not just a function of influence, but of raw, unbridled force. The aftermath was as bloody as the deed itself, with hundreds of his followers meeting the same grisly fate. It was a massacre disguised as a riot, a chilling testament to the lengths the Senate would go to preserve their grip on power. In the immediate wake of his death, the city was left in shock, grappling with the brutal realization that Rome's political landscape had irrevocably changed. The Forum, once the heart of Roman democracy, was now stained with the blood of reform. The senators who had orchestrated the killing tried to justify their actions, painting themselves as protectors of the Republic, defenders against Tiberius's supposed tyranny. But the damage was done. The myth of Rome, as a bastion of republican virtue shattered. Yet, as history often shows, death of a man is not the death of his ideas. Tiberius's reforms, though stalled, had planted a seed in the minds of the Roman populace. The land redistribution law, despite its bloody origins, lingered on as a testament to what could have been. It forced Rome to confront its systemic inequalities, laying bare the stark divisions between the haves and the have-nots. His death became a rallying cry for future reformers, a cautionary tale of both inspiration and warning. In the years that followed, the legacy of Tiberius Gracchus continued to haunt Rome. His brother, Gaius Gracchus, would pick up the mantle a decade later, pushing even further with ambitious reforms that echoed Tiberius's vision. Yet, the same forces that had conspired against Tiberius remained powerful and unyielding. The cycle of reform and repression became a tragic pattern in Roman politics, with each new attempt at change met with fierce resistance. The myth of Tiberius Gracchus grew in the retelling, transforming him into a symbol of resistance against tyranny and a martyr for the cause of the common people. Yet the reality was more complex. He was a man of contradictions, an aristocrat who championed the poor, a reformer with an eye for power. His methods, though bold, were not without their own flaws and risks. In challenging the Senate so directly, he had upended the delicate balance of Roman politics, a move that, while visionary, was also perilous. The tale of Tiberius Gracchus is a reminder of the risks inherent in challenging entrenched power. His story speaks to the enduring struggle between reform and tradition, the clash between ideals and the harsh realities of political life. It's a narrative as old as time, echoing through history wherever individuals have dared to dream of a better world. The lesson here is clear. Change, especially in a system as calcified as Rome's, is rarely a gentle process. It demands sacrifice, courage, and sometimes the ultimate price. In the grand tapestry of history, Tiberius Gracchus stands as a pivotal figure. His story is both an inspiration and a caution, a testament to the power of one man's vision to ignite change, and a sobering reminder of the dangers that come with challenging the status quo. As the dust of time settles, his legacy endures, woven into the fabric of Roman history as a symbol of what might have been and a beacon for those who would follow in his footsteps. So as the sun set over the eternal city, casting long shadows over the blood-stained stones, Rome was left to ponder its future. The road to reform would be long and treacherous, fraught with peril and promise. And while Tiberius Gracchus would no longer walk its path, his spirit would linger on, a restless force urging Rome toward a future that, though uncertain, was filled with the possibility of a more just and equitable world. Florence in the 15th century was like a Renaissance Coachella, minus the bands, but with a lot more frescoes. Picture a city buzzing with energy, where artists weren't just painting for peanuts, but for princely sums bankrolled by the Medici, the city's unofficial godfathers of culture. These guys weren't just shaking hands, they were shaking up Europe. Lorenzo de Medici, in particular, had a knack for sparring talent like a Renaissance Simon Cowell, only with more velvet and less snark. The city was a melting pot of ambition, and let's be honest, a healthy dose of ego. Everyone was scrambling to be the next Michelangelo or Leonardo. But here's the kicker, not everyone was a genius. In fact, many of these so-called masters were just really good at networking, and occasionally, yes, schmoozing. The big secret was that perspective. The mathematical trick that made paintings pop into 3 dimensions was the hot new thing, kind of like how everyone suddenly needed a smartphone in the early 2000s. And who do we have to thank for this artistic revolution? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. First up, Filippo Brunelleschi, the Renaissance's answer to an architectural genius with a penchant for dramatic flair. His work on the Florence Cathedral dome was like the Super Bowl of engineering feats, completed in 1436 after a nail-biting 16 years. It was a massive statement piece that screamed, Florence is open for business. But don't be fooled into thinking Brunelleschi did it all out of the goodness of his heart. He was handsomely rewarded, pocketing a salary of 100 florins per year, an absolute fortune when the average craftsman made about 10 florins. While Brunelleschi was busy defying gravity, other artists were busy redefining reality. Enter Masaccio, a painter who figured out that adding a little depth to your work could make it a lot less flat, literally and figuratively. In 1425, His frescoes in the Brancacci chapel threw viewers into a world where figures seemed to leap out of the walls, a bit like watching a 3D movie, minus the glasses. The illusion of space was so convincing that it left people wondering if they'd need to duck to avoid a rogue spear. But let's not get carried away with the notion that everyone was a revolutionary. Most artists were more like Renaissance cover bands, riffing on the hits of the big names while adding their own twist. The term genius was thrown around like confetti, but in reality, many were simply competent craftsmen who knew how to work a room full of patrons. You didn't need to be the next Michelangelo. You just needed to know him, or, even better, be liked by someone with deep pockets. Speaking of deep pockets, the Medici family didn't just fund art for art's sake. Their patronage was as much about power as it was about paintings. By financing the likes of Botticelli and Donatello, they weren't just creating a cultural legacy. They were buying influence and solidifying their status as the city's kingmakers. Think of them as the original influencers, only instead of selfies, they were commissioning masterpieces. It's easy to romanticize the Renaissance as a golden age of creativity, but the reality was more complex. The economics of art were a delicate dance of supply and demand, with artists often more concerned with securing contracts than creating timeless pieces. And while we're on the subject of myths, let's debunk one right here. The Renaissance wasn't a time when everyone suddenly woke up with a paintbrush in hand. Most people were more concerned with day-to-day survival than with contemplating the subtleties of chiaroscuro. Sure, the Medici were patrons of the arts, but they were also savvy politicians who used their investments to curry favor and control. Their support of artists was as strategic as it was philanthropic, a reminder that money and politics have always been strange bedfellows. The Renaissance might have been a time of extraordinary artistic output, but it was also a time of ruthless power plays and social maneuvering. Florence may have been the cradle of the Renaissance, but it was also a stage set for drama, competition, and let's face it, a bit of backstabbing. Behind every masterpiece was a story of ambition, rivalry, and the relentless pursuit of glory. And as the city emerged as a cultural juggernaut, it did so on the shoulders of artists who were just as much about the hustle as they were about the art. They knew that in a world where fortunes could be as fleeting as fame, it paid to be both talented and tenacious. In the end, the Renaissance was less about the mythical genius and more about the gritty reality of making it to the top and staying there. As Florence set the stage for an era of cultural fireworks, the Renaissance wasn't content to stay cooped up in one Italian city, no matter how grand its cathedrals or how powerful its patrons. Like a medieval tick-tock dance, the Renaissance went viral, spreading across Europe faster than you can say Mona Lisa's smile. The movement's caravans hit the road, rolling into cities like Venice, Rome, and Milan, and crossing borders to places like Paris, London, and beyond. It was as if Europe had collectively decided it was time to swap out the medieval drudgery for a splash of color and a touch of genius, or at least the illusion of it. The secret ingredient to this cultural contagion, the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's brainchild, this medieval marvel was the smartphone of its day, only with fewer selfies and more scripture. Invented around 1440, the printing press was like a magic trick that turned the painstaking art of copying books into an efficient assembly line. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't just for monks in dusty monasteries. It was available to anyone who could get their hands on a book. And let's not pretend these books were all highbrow. Sure, the Bible was a bestseller, but so were texts on astrology, romance, and yes, some rather racy poetry. Gutenberg's press was churning out information at an unprecedented rate, and Europe was hooked. The real kicker, though, was the impact on education and the exchange of ideas. Colleges and universities started popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, fueled by the newfound accessibility of written knowledge. Between 1450 and 1500, the number of universities in Europe doubled, and enrollment soared like the latest viral video. Literacy rates began to rise, though let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't like everyone suddenly became Isaac Newton, but even a modest bump in literacy was enough to stoke the fires of intellectual curiosity. As ideas flowed more freely, so did the gossip. The printing press was a double-edged quill, spreading not just enlightenment, but also rumors and scandal. Pamphlets and broadsheets were the medieval tabloids, and they didn't shy away from the juicy stuff. Political intrigue, check. Salacious love affairs, you bet. The press became a tool for both propaganda and dissent, a platform for voices that had long been silenced. It's no surprise that the powers that be weren't thrilled about this newfangled freedom of the press. Rulers and religious leaders were quick to clamp down on anything they deemed subversive, but the genie was already out of the bottle. While the printing press was busy making everyone feel like a scholar, the political landscape was playing out more like an episode of House of Cards, complete with shifty deals and the occasional poisoning. The Renaissance was not just a cultural renaissance. It was a time of intense political maneuvering. Cities and states were jockeying for power, forming alliances and breaking them faster than a medieval marriage. Italy, in particular, was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own agenda and a penchant for double-crossing. You couldn't swing a paintbrush in Florence or Venice without hitting a political plot. The Medici, for example, were masters of the political game, using their wealth and connections to pull strings behind the scenes. They were the puppet masters, and the rest of Italy danced to their tune, at least until someone else cut the strings. To say it was cutthroat would be an understatement. Poisonings were a favorite pastime among the elite, and I'm not talking about the kind of food poisoning you get from bad clams. These were deliberate, strategic eliminations, often involving a cup of wine and a not-so-subtle hint of arsenic. Elsewhere, the English were having their own brand of Renaissance fun. Henry Roman VIII, that old charmer, was busy reshaping England in the image of his own whims. He wasn't just a king. He was an influencer with a crown, using his power to redefine religion and culture to suit his personal desires. The English Renaissance was as much about politics as it was about poetry. It was a time when words could topple a king or elevate a humble playwright to fame. Shakespeare, anyone. He was the Renaissance's answer to a blockbuster director, churning out hits that packed the Globe Theatre like a rock concert. And let's not forget France, where Francis I was turning the Louvre into a showcase for Renaissance art and ideas. He was a patron of the arts with a penchant for grandeur, snapping up Italian artists like they were going out of style. Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years in France under Francis's patronage, proving that even a genius could appreciate a cushy retirement plan. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire was a mosaic of territories that made modern-day Europe look like a piece of cake to manage. Charles V, the emperor, had the unenviable job of trying to keep it all together while dealing with the rise of Protestantism and the fallout from Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517. The Reformation was a seismic shift that rattled Europe's foundations and reshaped its religious landscape. It was a time when faith and politics were so intertwined that you couldn't have one without the other. As the Renaissance spread, it was clear that it was more than just a cultural revolution. It was a social and political upheaval. It was a time when new ideas challenged old beliefs, and the balance of power shifted like sand underfoot. The Renaissance was a dance of light and shadow, where beauty and brutality coexisted in a delicate balance. It was a time of great works and great conflicts, of soaring achievements and sobering realities. And while the art and ideas of the Renaissance continue to captivate us, it's worth remembering that behind every masterpiece and every myth, there's a story of ambition, rivalry, and the relentless pursuit of something greater. In the end, the Renaissance was less about the myths we love to tell, and more about the people who lived it, the dreamers and doers, the schemers and survivors. It was a mosaic of humanity in all its complexity, a reminder that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven with the threads of countless lives. And as we continue to explore its legacy, let's do so with an eye for both the romance and the reality, for the legends and the lives behind them. And speaking of legends and harsh realities, let's dive into one of the most galactic shifts of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution. Yeah, this was the chapter when the universe decided to pull a fast one on us mere mortals, and boy, was it a cosmic curveball. Imagine the church's surprise when it turned out the Earth wasn't the celestial VIP it thought it was. For centuries, the geocentric model, the idea that Earth was the center of the universe, was gospel truth, quite literally. After all, if you're going to be the spiritual epicenter of human existence, you might as well have your planet front and center too, right? Cue Copernicus, the unwitting Renaissance disruptor. This Polish mathematician and astronomer rolled in like the original cosmic influencer, dropping a truth bomb that would make even the most seasoned tick-tock star blush. In 1543, Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, or, for those who skipped Latin, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. This wasn't just a book. It was a full-blown manifesto that proposed a heliocentric model, placing the sun, not Earth, at the center of our cosmic dance. Talk about a plot twist. Copernicus basically told the world that we were all just spinning around like a bunch of celestial backup dancers orbiting the real star of the show, our sun. Now, let's not pretend Copernicus was met with open arms and confetti. His ideas were like a philosophical grenade tossed into the medieval understanding of the cosmos. Sure, some intellectual circles were intrigued, but the church, not so much. While Copernicus had the good sense to publish his work at the end of his life, perhaps knowing full well the kind of ruckus it would cause, his heliocentric theory was initially dismissed as just another eccentric idea. But the seed was planted, and as we all know, ideas can be like weeds in a garden. They spread. Fast forward to Galileo Galilei, the man who took Copernicus's theory and ran with it like it was a baton in a relay race. Galileo was the Renaissance equivalent of a rock star scientist, complete with the maverick attitude to match. In 1609, he pointed his homemade telescope at the heavens and started documenting what he saw. And what a sight it was. Moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, and a whole lot of evidence that made the geocentric model look about as credible as a flat Earth theory. By 1610, Galileo published Sidereus Nuncius, or The Starry Messenger, a book that read like a love letter to the universe, and a break-up note to centuries of established doctrine. The Church, predictably, was not amused. You see, Galileo's findings didn't just challenge astronomical beliefs. They challenged the entire theological framework that propped up the Church's authority. If Earth wasn't the center of the universe, what did that say about humanity's place in the grand scheme of things? The implications were as unsettling as they were profound. Galileo's heliocentric observations were like a cosmic slap in the face to religious orthodoxy, and the Church wasn't about to turn the other cheek. In 1660, the Church officially declared heliocentrism heretical, which was about as subtle as a medieval inquisition. But Galileo, being the stubborn scientist he was, continued to advocate for his findings. His 1632 publication, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, was a thinly veiled endorsement of the heliocentric model, cleverly written as a conversation between characters who represented different viewpoints. It was an intellectual sparring match, and Galileo wasn't shy about stacking the deck in favor of the sun-centered universe. This earned him a one-way ticket to the Roman Inquisition, where he faced the ecclesiastical equivalent of a medieval courtroom drama. In 1633, Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy and forced to recant his views. Legend has it that after his recantation, Galileo muttered under his breath, "E per se muove," and yet it moves, a defiant nod to the truth he believed in. Whether he actually said it or not, the phrase has become iconic, symbolizing the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of dogma. Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest, but his ideas couldn't be contained. The scientific revolution was like a runaway cart, picking up momentum and taking everyone along for the ride. Figures like Johannes Kepler and Sir Isaac Newton would continue where Galileo left off, each adding their own chapters to the evolving story of science. Kepler, with his laws of planetary motion, turned the celestial ballet into a precise dance of ellipses. Newton, with his law of universal gravitation, tied it all together with a neat bow, explaining how celestial bodies interacted with one another. But why did all this matter? It wasn't just about winning a cosmic popularity contest. The shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric model was a game changer, because it fundamentally altered our understanding of the universe and humanity's place within it. It was like moving from a flat map to a globe, giving us a richer, more complex view of reality. This new perspective paved the way for the Enlightenment, a period where reason and science began to challenge tradition and superstition. It was a time when humanity started to question everything from the natural world to the structures of power and belief. Of course, With great knowledge comes great responsibility and a fair bit of chaos. The scientific revolution wasn't just a series of eureka moments. It was a battleground of ideas where old and new clashed like titans. Institutions that had long held authority were now facing challenges from thinkers who dared to ask why and what if, questions that were as dangerous as they were revolutionary. The ripple effects were felt far and wide, influencing everything from navigation and medicine to agriculture and industry. In the grand tapestry of history, the scientific revolution was a vivid thread, weaving its way through the fabric of the Renaissance and beyond. It was a testament to human curiosity and the unyielding quest for truth, even when the truth was inconvenient or downright heretical. And while the Church eventually came to terms with the heliocentric model, it was a reminder that progress often comes with a price. The scientific revolution was both a triumph and a trial, a period of enlightenment that shone a light on the universe, and in doing so, illuminated the path to modernity. So, as we wrap up this cosmic caper, let's remember that the Renaissance wasn't just about pretty paintings and marble sculptures. It was a time when the universe itself became a canvas, and visionaries like Copernicus and Galileo dared to paint it in bold, new colors. And while their discoveries may have rattled the status quo, they also laid the groundwork for a future where science and reason would become the guiding stars. But don't worry, we're not done yet. The Renaissance still has a few more tricks up its sleeve, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned. As the Renaissance continued to unravel its complex tapestry, the world beyond Europe's borders was about to get a front row seat to this cultural circus. Spoiler alert, it was less a dignified exchange of ideas and more a chaotic mashup of exploration, exploitation, and let's face it, some good old-fashioned piracy. You see, while Europe was busy patting itself on the back for its artistic and scientific achievements, its explorers were out there, turning the world map into a battleground for spices, gold, and unfortunately, human lives. Let's start with Christopher Columbus, that intrepid navigator who stumbled upon the Americas in 1492 while searching for a quicker route to Asia. The irony here is thicker than the fog he sailed through. Columbus never actually made it to Asia, but he did manage to kickstart a whole new era of European imperialism. His voyages, funded by Spain, were the medieval equivalent of a high-stakes gamble, with Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand hoping to cash in on the luxury goods market. Little did they know, Columbus's discovery would open Pandora's box, setting off a chain reaction of conquest and colonization. In the blink of an eye, or about 50 years, to be precise, Spain and Portugal had carved up vast territories in the New World like a couple of overzealous real estate agents. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 was their attempt to keep things civil, dividing the newly discovered lands outside Europe between them. Spain got the lion's share of the Americas, while Portugal snagged Brazil, which they'd later transform into a sugar-producing powerhouse. But let's not pretend these were amicable arrangements. These guys weren't interested in sharing. They were interested in hoarding as much wealth as humanly possible. The Spanish conquistadors, led by figures like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, were less interested in cultural exchange and more into a brand of diplomacy that involved swords and smallpox. Cortés, for instance, waltzed into the Aztec Empire in 1519 with a handful of men and a lot of nerve, toppling the mighty empire by 1521. His secret weapon, a combination of superior military technology, strategic alliances with local tribes, and diseases that decimated the native population faster than you can say, biological warfare. By the time he was done, the Aztecs, whose capital Tenochtitlan was larger than any European city at the time, were left in ruins. Pizarro pulled a similar stunt in South America, conquering the Inca Empire in 1533. His method was straightforward: capture the emperor, demand a ransom, and then promptly execute him once the gold was delivered. The Incas, who had built an empire stretching over 500 miles along the Andes, were undone in a matter of months. It was a brutal reminder that while the Renaissance celebrated human achievement, it often came at a devastating human cost. And what did Europe gain from all this? Aside from a guilty conscience that still lingers today, got rich, really rich. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas turned the Spanish economy into a booming, albeit ultimately unsustainable, powerhouse. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported around 180 tons of gold and 17,000 tons of silver from the New World. This wealth fueled the European economy, allowing for the funding of more art, more wars, and more exploration. It was an economic boost like no other. Think of it as the Renaissance version of a gold rush. But this wasn't just a one-way street. The Columbian Exchange, as historians like to call it, was a massive transfer of goods, crafts, and unfortunately diseases between the Old and New Worlds. Europeans brought horses, cattle, and wheat to the Americas, while potatoes, tomatoes, and yes, syphilis made their way back to Europe. The potato, in particular, became a staple crop, revolutionizing European agriculture and diet. It was a culinary game-changer, though it would be a few centuries before anyone thought to turn them into French fries. However, let's not sugarcoat it. The Renaissance's global reach wasn't all about delightful culinary discoveries. The dark side of this cultural collision was the transatlantic slave trade, which saw millions of Africans forcibly transported to the New World to work on plantations. The demand for labor in the Americas was insatiable, and Europeans, in what can only be described as a moral failure of epic proportions, turned to the slave trade to meet it. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that the mere description is enough to make one shudder. The economic impacts of this forced migration were profound. The wealth generated from slavery and the trade of goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton built fortunes and fueled the European economy. This wasn't just a side note in history. It was the backbone of the colonial economy. Yet, for all the prosperity it brought to a select few, it left a legacy of suffering and inequality that echoes to this day. Now, while the European powers were busy carving up the Americas, the rest of the world wasn't just sitting idly by. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, was a formidable force during the Renaissance, controlling vast swaths of territory across the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. This wasn't just a military empire. It was a cultural melting pot, where art, science, and trade flourished in cities like Constantinople. The Ottomans, under the rule of sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent, were patrons of the arts in their own right, commissioning splendid works of architecture, literature, and music. Meanwhile, in the East, the Ming Dynasty in China was flexing its own cultural muscles. The Chinese were masters of porcelain and silk, products that were highly sought after in Europe. The Ming emperors also sponsored grand voyages of exploration under Admiral Zheng He, whose fleet of massive ships, some over 400 feet long, sailed as far as Africa. These voyages were as much about diplomacy as they were about trade, showcasing China's wealth and influence. However, by the mid-15th century, the Ming Dynasty turned inward, focusing on internal affairs and curtailing its maritime ambitions. This self-imposed isolation would later make it vulnerable to European powers eager to tap into its riches. In India, the Mughal Empire was in full swing, with rulers like Akbar the Great expanding its territory and promoting a rich blend of Persian and Indian culture. The Mughals were known for their architectural achievements, such as the Taj Mahal, and their contributions to art and literature. Their court was a hub of cultural exchange, where scholars, artists, and musicians from different backgrounds mingled. But as the Mughals consolidated power in the subcontinent, they also faced challenges from European traders eager to establish footholds in the region. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach India by sea, establishing a trading post at Goa in 1510. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new era of European involvement in Asia, one that would eventually lead to British dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries. This wasn't just about trade. It was about control. European powers were determined to dominate the lucrative spice trade, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. As the Renaissance spread its wings across the globe, it left behind a trail of triumph and tragedy. It was an age of exploration and exploitation, where the thirst for knowledge and wealth knew no bounds. The cultural exchanges that took place were monumental, reshaping societies and economies in ways that are still felt today. Yet, beneath the surface of this grand narrative lies a story of human cost, one that serves as a sobering reminder of the complexities of progress. So, as we continue this journey through the Renaissance, let's keep our eyes open to both the light and the shadows. This was a time when the world became smaller and larger all at once, when boundaries were tested and sometimes broken. And while the Renaissance may have started in the salons and studios of Europe, its legacy is a global one, bearing the marks of both its wonders and its wounds. Stay tuned, because the saga isn't over yet. There's more to uncover in this epic tale of ambition, art, and the relentless drive to shape the world. And so, as we stand on the shoulders of these Renaissance titans peering into the vast expanse of history, it's time to unravel why we can't seem to shake our collective crush on this era, despite its many warts. The Renaissance, it's like that ex you can't stop stalking on social media, full of drama, beauty, and a whole lot of messy. Sure, it's easy to fall for the romanticized version, all those glamorous artists, groundbreaking thinkers, and that intoxicating whiff of genius in the air. But the truth is, it was as much about hustle and hierarchy as it was about halos of creativity. So why do we still swoon over it? Well, strap in as we take a whirlwind tour through the lasting legacy of this tumultuous time. First up, let's tackle the myth of the Renaissance man. The Renaissance man, a jack of all trades who could paint a ceiling, compose a sonnet, and dissect a cadaver all before lunch. Think Leonardo da Vinci, the poster boy for this archetype. But let's not pretend everyone was a multi-talented maestro. In reality, most people were just trying to keep their heads above water in a world where specialization was often the key to survival. The idea of a well-rounded individual was more of an elite pastime than a widespread practice. While Leonardo might have been doodling flying machines, the average Joe was more concerned with the rise in grain prices or the latest outbreak of plague. The irony is that the Renaissance man myth is as much a product of modern nostalgia as it is of historical fact. We love the idea because it speaks to our own yearning for versatility in an age of hyper-specialization. Today, we're bombarded with messages to be everything, tech-savvy, culturally literate, and socially conscious, all while maintaining a work-life balance that would make even Leonardo break a sweat. The Renaissance man is our aspirational ghost, haunting us with the promise of potential unrealized. But while the notion of the Renaissance man might be more myth than reality, the era did lay down some serious groundwork for modernity. It was a time when innovation and chaos tangoed across Europe, leaving behind a trail of brilliance and blunders. Take banking, for example. The Medici family didn't just fund art, they revolutionized finance. Their development of double-entry bookkeeping was like the original fintech breakthrough, turning a risky, volatile business into a sophisticated operation. It laid the foundation for modern banking, which, love it or hate it, is the backbone of today's global economy. Without those early innovations, your online shopping spree might still involve a trek to the marketplace and a pocketful of coins. And speaking of economies, let's give a nod to the Renaissance's role in the birth of capitalism. The era saw the rise of a mercantile class that began to challenge the old feudal order. This wasn't just a bunch of merchants trading spices and silks. It was a seismic shift in how wealth and power were distributed. The bustling markets of Venice and the trading posts of Antwerp were the precursors to our modern-day stock exchanges, albeit with fewer regulations and more cutthroat deals. The pursuit of profit became a driving force, pushing European expansion and setting the stage for the capitalist system that dominates today. Of course, not all that glitters is gold, or in this case, Renaissance gold florins. The era's darker legacy is inextricably linked to the colonial exploitation and systemic inequalities that continue to ripple through history. The wealth amassed through conquest and colonization funded Europe's cultural renaissance, but left a trail of devastation and displacement. It's a sobering reminder that progress often comes at a staggering human cost, a lesson that resonates all too well in today's globalized world, where the gap between haves and have-nots yawns ever wider. Yet, for all its messiness, the Renaissance taught us the power of ideas. It was a time when questioning authority and challenging the status quo became a pastime for the bold and the brave. This spirit of inquiry and innovation is perhaps its most enduring legacy. It planted the seeds for the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, periods that would push humanity to rethink everything from the laws of nature to the very fabric of society. The Renaissance dared to ask, what if? And why not? Questions that continue to drive progress and provoke debate. So, what can this era teach us about our own age of innovation and chaos? Well, for one, it reminds us that creativity often flourishes in times of upheaval. The Renaissance thrived on the tension between old and new, between tradition and transformation. Today, as we grapple with technological advancements that seem to outpace our ability to comprehend them, it's worth remembering that disruption is nothing new. Humanity has always found ways to adapt and innovate, often in the most unexpected ways. Moreover, the Renaissance underscores the importance of diverse perspectives. It was a time when cross-cultural exchanges sparked new ideas and broadened horizons. In a world that sometimes feels more divided than ever, embracing diversity, not just as a buzzword, but as a catalyst for creativity and collaboration, could be the key to navigating our own turbulent times. And finally, let's not forget the power of the individual to effect change. The Renaissance was a mosaic of personalities, from visionary artists to pioneering scientists, each contributing their own brushstroke to the canvas of history. In an era of mass movements and digital tribes, the stories of these individuals remind us that personal passion and perseverance can leave a lasting mark on the world. As we wrap up this rollicking ride through the Renaissance, let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't all sunshine and sculptors. But its complexities and contradictions are precisely what make it so fascinating. It was a period where art and ambition, beauty and brutality coexisted in a delicate dance. And while we may never fully unravel its mysteries, the Renaissance beckons us to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep dreaming. So, whether you're a budding polymath or a specialist in your corner of the cosmos, take a cue from the Renaissance. Embrace the chaos, challenge the conventional, and never stop seeking the sublime. After all, history is more than a series of dates and events. It's a living tapestry, woven with the threads of human triumphs and trials. And as we look to the future, let's carry forward the spirit of the Renaissance, a reminder that even in the midst of turmoil, the human spirit can soar to remarkable heights. If you ever wanted to know how a king with a powdered wig and a penchant for flute solos could also wield a sword and command one of Europe's most feared armies, let me introduce you to Frederick the Great. Born in 1712 in Berlin, this guy was the original Renaissance man of Northern Europe. If your definition of Renaissance man includes both Bach and battlefield bloodshed. Frederick, or Fritz as his friends might have called him, was a study in contradictions. He'd go from quoting Voltaire to ordering a cavalry charge faster than you can say Prussian discipline. But before he was the Great, he was just a kid with a stuffed owl and a father who thought books were for weaklings. Frederick William I, Frederick's father, was a man who loved two things: the army and, well, the army. He was so obsessed with building a military machine that he supposedly collected giant soldiers like they were Parkhamen cards. This regiment of uber-tall troops, known as the Potsdam Giants, was his pride and joy. But Frederick, he was less interested in how to march in step and more intrigued by how to compose a sonata. This was a royal family where the love language was more hup, 2, 3, 4, than do, re, mi. Frederick's early life was a bit like a sitcom where the father and son are polar opposites. His dad wanted him to be a warrior king, while young Frederick was more interested in waltzing through life with a flute under his arm. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a very, very military round hole. Imagine being a kid who gets grounded not for sneaking out to a party, but for sneaking in a quick read of the latest philosophical treatise. One of Frederick's little acts of rebellion was his affection for music and philosophy, which didn't exactly scream Prussian military hardliner. But it's not like Frederick had it easy. His father was known for his temper, and their relationship was famously rocky. At one point, Frederick William ordered his son's best friend, Hans Hermann von Katt, executed after the duo attempted to run away to England. Talk about harsh parenting. Frederick was forced to watch the beheading from his prison cell, which is one way to make a point about the importance of loyalty, I guess. It was a traumatic event that stayed with him for life, but it also seemed to fuel his determination to carve his own path. Frederick's love for the arts and philosophy wasn't just a teenage phase. He corresponded with the great Voltaire, exchanging over 700 letters with the French philosopher. These weren't just, "Hey, how are you?" notes either. They discussed everything from politics to the nature of the universe. Yet, despite his love for intellectual pursuits, Frederick could flip the switch to military strategist in a heartbeat. When he ascended to the throne in 1740, he decided to flex his military muscles by invading Silesia. Because if you can't win your father's approval, why not win some territory instead? This early invasion kicked off the War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict that would span 8 years and cement Frederick's reputation as a formidable military leader. Under his rule, Prussia's army not only grew in size, but also in reputation. Frederick transformed his father's disciplined troops into an effective fighting force, proving that you could be both a military genius and a patron of the arts. In a time when most monarchs used their power to amass wealth and wear increasingly ridiculous hats, Frederick was using it to expand borders and patronize composers. But let's not romanticize him too much. Frederick's idea of peacetime was basically a chance to prepare for the next war. He was known for his strict discipline and unwavering focus on military efficiency. While the arts flourished under his patronage, his military campaigns left a trail of destruction across Europe. And yet, he remains a figure of fascination, a leader who managed to straddle the line between the enlightened ideals of the Enlightenment and the brutal realities of 18th century warfare. Frederick's early life and career were a testament to his complex character. He was a man who could pen poetry and then turn around and devise a battle plan. His rivalry with his father set the stage for his lifelong balancing act between the arts and the art of war. In a world that seemed to demand you pick a side, Frederick the Great chose both, and in doing so, he left a legacy that continues to intrigue and inspire. So, whether you're a fan of military history or just wondering how someone could enjoy a good minuet while planning a military maneuver, Frederick's story is bound to keep you hooked. Frederick's story was far from over. It was just getting started. With the crown on his head and a thirst for glory, Frederick didn't waste any time getting his hands dirty. So let's dive into the War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict that would see Frederick flex his muscles and Prussia punch above its weight class. The stakes were higher than a German Oompa band on festival day, with Silesia right at the heart of it all. This wasn't just Frederick's playground. It was a gold mine, and not just metaphorically. Silesia was economically juicy, boasting a rich tapestry of resources, including coal and iron, and a bustling textile industry. It was like the Silicon Valley of 18th century Central Europe, but with more sheep and less Wi-Fi. Now, you might think Frederick just waltzed in and claimed victory like a boss, but history isn't an Instagram highlight reel. The truth is, his victories were anything but flawless. Sure, he had a few tactical strokes of genius that would make Sun Tzu nod in approval, but he also faced plenty of setbacks that could have ended in disaster. Take the Battle of Malwitz in 1741, for example, Frederick's debut on the battlefield. It wasn't exactly a textbook entry. Our boy Freddie panicked and fled the field, leaving his troops to fend for themselves. Talk about a learning experience. Lucky for him, his generals, particularly the ever-reliable Field Marshal Kurt von Schwerin, stepped up to the plate, turning what could have been a fiasco into a victory. It's like winning a game of chess after accidentally knocking over the board. Despite not being the poster child for courage that day, Frederick learned valuable lessons in leadership and strategy. He'd come to understand that war wasn't just about who had the biggest guns. It was about playing a high-stakes game of chess, where every move mattered. His talent for blending warfare with diplomacy became his calling card. He knew that winning on the battlefield was only half the battle. The other half was securing those victories with cunning political maneuvers. In the grand scheme of things, Frederick was more of a Machiavellian player than a brawny Hercules. And let's not forget the real-life costs of these campaigns. Frederick's military adventures weren't just a game of risk played with real armies. Every clash came with a hefty price tag, both economically and in human lives. Prussia's treasury felt the pinch as funds were funneled into sustaining an army on the move. Meanwhile, the civilian population faced the harsh realities of war, displacement, destruction, and the ever-looming spectre of famine. Frederick's ambitions were paid for with the sweat and blood of his people, a stark reminder that even the most glorious victories come with a cost ledger that doesn't balance in favor of the common folk. As the war dragged on, Frederick's strategic brilliance became more refined. He developed a knack for rapid flanking maneuvers and swift marching, using speed as his ally to outmaneuver slower opponents. The Prussian army moved like a well-oiled machine, a testament to Frederick's emphasis on discipline and training. It was less about the size of the force, and more about how effectively it could be deployed. It's like showing up to a sword fight with a scalpel, precision over brute force. However, this wasn't just Frederick's show. The international stage was teeming with power plays, and Frederick had to navigate a diplomatic minefield. The War of Austrian Succession wasn't merely a Prussian affair. It involved almost every major power in Europe. It was a continental buffet of alliances, treaties, and betrayals. Countries like France, Spain, and Britain all had their own agendas, and Frederick had to keep his wits about him to avoid becoming a pawn in someone else's game. In this diplomatic dance, Frederick proved adept at keeping Prussia's interests front and center. His correspondence with Voltaire wasn't just about intellectual musings. It was also about solidifying alliances and understanding the political landscape. Frederick wasn't above using charm and wit as weapons, proving that sometimes a well-placed quip could be as powerful as a cannonball. But let's not paint him as a saint of diplomacy. Frederick was also a master of deceit when it suited his purposes. He wasn't afraid to break treaties or shift allegiances if it meant gaining an advantage. To him, the ends often justified the means, a pragmatic approach that won him both admirers and enemies. The war finally came to a conclusion with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, a diplomatic hodgepodge that left everyone feeling equally dissatisfied. But Frederick walked away with Silesia firmly under Prussian control, a testament to his strategic acumen and relentless determination. He managed to turn Prussia from a regional player into a force that demanded respect on the European stage. In the end, Frederick's role in the War of Austrian Succession was a testament to his complex character. On one hand, he was a brilliant tactician and a cunning diplomat. On the other, his campaigns left a wake of destruction and suffering that couldn't be overlooked. His story is a reminder that the line between genius and madness is often razor-thin, especially when you're attempting to reshape the map of Europe with a quill in one hand and a sword in the other. So, as we move forward in Frederick's tale, remember that his legend is as much about the shadows as it is about the spotlight. The man who could pen poetry and orchestrate battles was also one who understood that power, like beauty, was often in the eye of the beholder. His legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, ambition and consequence. And if there's one thing Frederick the Great teaches us, it's that history is never black and white. It's a canvas painted in all the shades of human complexity. As Frederick the Great emerged from the fog of war, his focus pivoted from the bloody chessboard of Europe to the domestic arena of Prussia, a realm rife with its own challenges and opportunities. Frederick was determined to transform his kingdom into a modern state, a land where reason reigned supreme and potatoes were the new gold. Yes, potatoes, those humble tubers that Frederick famously championed, became a symbol of his push towards agricultural innovation. It's not exactly a glamorous legacy, but when your country's food supply is as shaky as a Jenga tower in an earthquake, potatoes are a game changer. Frederick's agricultural reforms were more than just a root vegetable revolution. They were part of a broader strategy to modernize Prussia's economy. By promoting the cultivation of potatoes, he aimed to reduce the risk of famine, which was a bit like trying to prevent a forest fire with a garden hose, but commendable nonetheless. The potato was hardy, nutritious, and could survive in soil that would make most crops weep in despair. Frederick even resorted to reverse psychology to encourage his skeptical peasants to plant them. He declared potatoes a royal food, guarded the fields with soldiers, and lo and behold, the peasants soon followed suit, eager to taste this forbidden fruit. But let's not get too misty-eyed over Frederick's green thumb. His agricultural policies were as much about control as they were about innovation. He wanted a self-sufficient state, one that could withstand the trials of war without collapsing into chaos. It's like building a sandcastle with concrete, solid foundations for uncertain times. Frederick's reforms extended beyond the fields, reaching into the very heart of Prussian industry. He established new factories and encouraged the production of textiles, iron and glass, laying the groundwork for an industrial revolution that would eventually sweep across Europe. Frederick was nothing if not practical. He introduced new taxes to fund his projects, which, predictably, didn't earn him any friends among the nobility. But he was relentless in his pursuit of progress, like a kid building a Lego empire and refusing to stop for dinner. He knew that economic strength was the backbone of military might, a lesson drilled into him through the endless campaigns of his youth. Frederick's domestic policies were all about creating a lean, mean, economic machine that could keep the Prussian war chest full and the army ready to march at a moment's notice. In tandem with these economic and agricultural feats, Frederick the Great was also a champion of religious tolerance, a rarity in an era when burning heretics was practically a weekend hobby. He famously declared, "All religions must be tolerated, for every man must get to heaven in his own way." It sounds like a page out of an Enlightenment pamphlet, but Frederick saw religious diversity as a practical asset. By opening Prussia's doors to Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and other religious minorities, he was able to draw in skilled workers and intellectuals who bolstered his burgeoning economy. Yet, there's a twist. Frederick's tolerance was less about a deep respect for human rights and more about economic pragmatism. He was like a shrewd CEO, more interested in what his employees could produce than where they prayed. His policies were a balancing act between Enlightenment ideals and autocratic rule, a tightrope walk that kept Prussia stable while the rest of Europe wobbled on the brink of religious wars. Frederick's approach was both visionary and coldly calculating, a reminder that even the most enlightened ideas can be wielded as tools of power. The contradictions of Frederick's rule didn't stop at religious tolerance. While he was busy quoting Voltaire and writing philosophical essays, he was also a dyed-in-the-wool autocrat. His word was law, and he wielded it with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Frederick was the state, and the state was Frederick, a mantra that left little room for dissent. He centralized authority with an iron grip, ensuring that every decision flowed through his court. It was the kind of top-down management that would make a corporate executive blush. Frederick's Enlightenment ideals clashed headlong with his autocratic tendencies, creating a leadership style that was as paradoxical as it was effective. He was a king who could pen an ode to liberty while simultaneously quashing any hint of rebellion. The freedom he championed in theory was often curtailed in practice, a reality that didn't go unnoticed by his subjects. You could say Frederick was a walking contradiction, a ruler who straddled the line between philosopher-king and absolute monarch, with a deftness that left his contemporaries scrambling to catch up. His reforms and policies laid the groundwork for a Prussia that was both militarily formidable and economically robust, a state that could punch above its weight on the European stage. But as much as Frederick advanced his kingdom, he also left behind a legacy of contradictions that would echo through the corridors of history. His story, like the man himself, was a complex tapestry of triumph and contradiction, a reminder that the pursuit of greatness often requires walking the razor's edge between idealism and reality. As we leave Frederick's domestic realm for now, it's clear that his legacy is as multifaceted as the man himself, a ruler who could see both the beauty in a well-played sonata and the necessity of a well-executed siege, king who reveled in the arts yet never shied away from the harshest realities of power. And so, as we prepare to delve deeper into his tale, remember that Frederick the Great was a man who embraced the chaos of his time, turning it into a symphony that still resonates today. As we delve deeper into Frederick the Great's legacy, brace yourself for the whirlwind that was the 7 Years' War, a conflict so sprawling it could put any modern blockbuster to shame. Forget the Avengers. This was the 18th century's version of a global showdown, with Frederick smack dab in the middle of it, juggling military tactics like a maestro conducting an orchestra with cannons instead of cellos. It all kicked off in 1756, when Frederick decided that waiting for a storm to pass is for mere mortals, not Prussian kings. So, he preemptively invaded Saxony, figuring that the best defense is a good offense, especially when your neighbors are sharpening their swords. This sparked a conflict that spread faster than a rumor in a royal court, dragging in heavyweights like Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and even Spain. It was basically a world tour of warfare, with battles fought in Europe, North America, India, and beyond. And somewhere in the midst of it all was Frederick, the so-called invincible warrior, trying to keep his head above water. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the myth that Frederick was some untouchable military genius. Sure, the man had flair. He was the David Bowie of battlefield strategy, constantly reinventing himself with each campaign. But the truth was, he wasn't immune to the chaos and unpredictability of war. Frederick's victories were hard-won, and his losses were often devastating. Take the Battle of Kunersdorf in 1759, for example. Here, Frederick faced a coalition of Austrian and Russian forces, and in a moment of overconfidence, led his troops into one of the most crushing defeats of his career. Out of 50,000 soldiers, he lost nearly 19,000. That's the kind of oops moment that makes you want to crawl under a rock and never come out. Frederick himself called Kunersdorf the most terrible day of his life, and didn't shy away from expressing his despair. In a letter to his minister, he wrote, "I believe everything is lost. I shall not survive the ruin of my country. Farewell forever." Dramatic? Maybe. Honest? Absolutely. It was a reminder that even the greatest military minds can have bad days at the office. Days that involve losing entire armies rather than misplacing your stapler. But here's where the legend of Frederick the Great gets interesting. Despite the setbacks, he never threw in the towel. Like a boxer with a penchant for Beethoven, he kept getting back into the ring. His resilience was awe-inspiring, even if it sometimes teetered on the edge of sheer stubbornness. After Kunersdorf, he regrouped, re-strategized, and managed to pull off a series of improbable victories. This wasn't just luck or divine intervention. It was the result of relentless training, an iron will, and an uncanny ability to adapt. However, this whirlwind of battles took a massive toll on Prussia. If Frederick was the face of the war, then the Prussian economy was its battered backbone. The costs of sustaining a war on multiple fronts were astronomical. By the war's end in 1763, Prussia was swimming in debt, to the tune of 120 million thalers, a debt that was as much a part of Frederick's legacy as any battlefield triumph. This financial strain was like a hangover that lasted for years, forcing the kingdom into austerity measures that would make even the most frugal of finance ministers wince. The human cost was equally staggering. Prussia's population was decimated, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of the male population was lost to the war. Towns were razed, fields were left barren, and the civilian population bore the brunt of Frederick's ambition. The romantic image of gallant battles fades quickly when faced with the grim reality of families torn apart and livelihoods destroyed. Yet, despite all this, Frederick emerged from the war with his reputation intact, even enhanced. How? Well, the man was as much a PR wizard as he was a military strategist. He knew how to spin a narrative, to present his setbacks as mere stepping stones on the path to glory. His correspondence, writings, and even the art commissioned during his reign all contributed to an image of Frederick as the unyielding warrior king, a man who could bend fate to his will. It's like turning a flop into a cult classic. Frederick managed to convince Europe that the war was a testament to Prussian resilience rather than a near-catastrophic gamble. The geopolitical landscape of Europe was irrevocably altered by the 7 Years' War. Prussia emerged as a major power, no longer a secondary player on the European stage. The war's conclusion, marked by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, saw Frederick maintain his hold on Silesia, a testament to his strategic prowess, even if it came at an enormous cost. The treaty reshaped the map of Europe, redrawing borders and shifting alliances, with Frederick's Prussia sitting at the new table of power brokers. But let's not get too caught up in the romantic image of Frederick as the invincible hero. The reality was far more nuanced. He was a man who understood the art of war and the power of perception, but he was also acutely aware of the precariousness of his position. His victories were as much about survival as they were about conquest, a delicate dance between ambition and pragmatism. Frederick's story is a reminder that history is rarely as tidy as the tales we tell. It's messy, complicated, and full of contradictions, just like the man himself. As we continue to explore Frederick's later years, remember that his legacy is not just about the battles he won or the territories he gained. It's about the choices he made, the risks he took, and the price he and his kingdom paid. In the end, Frederick the Great was both a product and a shaper of his time, a leader who straddled the fine line between triumph and tragedy with a deftness that continues to captivate us today. So, buckle up, because the tale of Frederick the Great is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as compelling. Frederick the Great's legacy is a patchwork quilt of contradictions, sewn together with threads of brilliance, ambition, and a fair share of gritty realities. As the dust settled after the 7 Years' War, Frederick found himself at the helm of a kingdom that had clawed its way to the top tier of European powers, albeit with a slightly bruised ego and a national debt that could rival the GDP of a small island nation. His impact on European politics was seismic, not just because he enlarged Prussia's territory or knocked a few teeth out of Austria's imperial grin. No, Frederick's real stroke of genius was how he reshaped the playing field itself. Before him, Prussia was just that awkward kid in the corner of the continental playground. By the end of his reign, it was a heavyweight contender whose military innovations were the envy of every monarch with a taste for conquest. The Prussian model of warfare centered on meticulous discipline, fast maneuverability, and that ever-iconic goose step became the blueprint for modern military strategy. Frederick's army was like a Swiss watch, precise, efficient, and liable to cost you an arm and a leg to replicate. And Frederick's influence didn't stop at the parade ground. His domestic policies were a masterclass in enlightened absolutism, a political oxymoron if there ever was one. Here was a king who could host philosophical salons by day and oversee a bureaucratic reformation by night. He centralized governance with the finesse of a chess grandmaster, ensuring that the Prussian state was as slick as a freshly polished cuirass. His investment in infrastructure, like the construction of the famous Frederick's Canal, was about as subtle as a cannonball, but undeniably effective, boosting trade and connecting Berlin to the Oder River with a watery highway. But let's not sugarcoat it. Frederick's reign wasn't all flutes and enlightenment. His rule was as iron-fisted as any despot's, with a penchant for censorship and a legal system more tangled than a cat in a yarn factory. The man who championed intellectual freedom was also the one who kept a tight leash on the press and punished dissent with a zeal that would make a dystopian novelist blush. Frederick's Prussia was a paradox, a land of progressive reforms underpinned by an unyielding autocracy. His cultural impact was equally paradoxical. Frederick was an aficionado of French culture, preferring it over the native German influences of his court. He spoke French, wrote poetry in French, and even styled his gardens at Sanssouci in a manner that would make Versailles nod in agreement. Yet, despite his Francophile tendencies, Frederick inadvertently paved the way for a burgeoning sense of German identity. His reign laid the cultural and political foundations that would eventually lead to the unification of Germany, a creation myth spun from the very fabric of Prussian ambition. And how was Frederick viewed by his contemporaries and those who came after? Well, opinions were as varied as the man himself. To some, he was the philosopher king, a living embodiment of the Enlightenment's ideals. To others, he was a ruthless warmonger, a Machiavellian figure who bathed in the blood of Europe to wash away his insecurities. Voltaire, his on-again, off-again pen pal, called him a man who set Europe on fire and then sang about it. It's the kind of backhanded compliment that only an 18th century intellectual could deliver. Later historians have been equally divided. Some hail Frederick as a visionary who dragged Prussia kicking and screaming into the modern age. Others criticize him as a brutal autocrat whose wars left a trail of devastation that far outweighed any territorial gains. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Frederick was a leader who wore many hats: reformer, warrior, artist, and autocrat. He was a man who could see the beauty in a minuet and the utility in a bayonet, a ruler who understood that power wasn't just about holding the cards, but about knowing when to play them. So why does Frederick the Great continue to captivate modern audiences? Perhaps it's because he embodies the complexity of human nature itself, a blend of light and shadow, genius and folly. His story is a reminder that history is not a static tableau of heroes and villains, but a living tapestry of decisions, mistakes, and triumphs. Frederick's life is a lesson in the art of balance, a tightrope walk between the ideals we strive for and the realities we must contend with. As we wrap up our exploration of Frederick's legacy, it's clear that his impact resonates far beyond the borders of his beloved Prussia. He was a man who dared to dream big, who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, and who wasn't afraid to wield the tools at his disposal, whether they were cannons or concertos, to shape it. Frederick the Great may have been a king of contradictions, but it's precisely those contradictions that make him such an enduring figure. In the end, his story is one of transformation, both of a kingdom and of a man, forever etched into the annals of history with the indelible ink of ambition and the echo of a flute.